100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, when the 19th Amendment was trying to be passed by all the states, in Pennsylvania, some suffragettes came up with this idea that they were going to make a replica of the Liberty Bell and use it to get out the vote. Because they had to get men to vote for a women's right to vote. And they created this bell. It was like the Liberty Bell. It was a huge bell, and they put it on the back of a flatbed pickup truck. And they went around Pennsylvania, going from county to county, and wherever they went, they'd make an event around, come out and see this replica of the Liberty Bell, and people did. People were really interested. But what they'd done is they'd taken the clapper, the part of the bell that makes it ring, and they had so when they go to ring it, people would be like, why doesn't it ring? It doesn't ring. And they'd say, because it is chained, just like us. Its voice is chained and it cannot ring out. It cannot be heard. So we're asked, and let us be heard. It didn't happen right away that Pennsylvania passed the amendment, but eventually it did. And when it did, they unchained the clapper and rang the bell. I am no one's baby. I am not a girl. I have spent some decades rattling around this world. I decided to make a music video to celebrate this fight that we fought and won 100 years ago this year. And when I heard this story about the Justice Bell, about unchaining our voices, I realized that this symbol of justice for all had to be a part of this story. The video opens on a little girl pulling on a rope. Nothing happens. So we follow this rope up to this enormous bell, and we see that it's chained. And then we shift to a path along the river with Megan, that's me, walking along, and I'm singing this song. And as I walk, another woman joins me, and then another. And then we walk together on this path singing, and then two more join us. This one, it's an older woman, and she's bringing with her the little girl. And then 4 more women join, and more, and the group grows exponentially as we walk, so that when we arrive at our destination, the Justice Bell, we are over 100 women strong. Now, at this point in the song, the gospel choir joins in. I try to choose the truth. That's how I found my And the song ends with all the women picking up this long rope, hands of all different strengths and colors, ages, pulling together. The chain from the bell drops to the ground, and as the last chord of the song is struck, the bell rings out. And then the final shot brings us back to the older woman and a little girl standing at the bell as the little girl reaches up and takes the older woman's hand. I wanted to sing it as a thank you to all of the women who have been courageous enough to speak their truth, especially right now into a society that might not want to hear it. When we raise our voices together, there's this thing that happens. It feels really, really good. If you raise your voice, especially with other people, it resonates and it vibrates, and it actually changes the way you feel.
And that was just the world!
This year, the year 2020, the year of the woman, is the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, giving me the right to vote. And it's also an election year. We've been given a voice, so let's raise it. I am a river rock, tumbled smooth by the rush of life, this life I choose. So to find out how you can add your voice to this movement, please click the link below for the new nationwide casting call for River Rock. I am no one's baby, I am not a girl. I have spent some decades rattling round this world. I am not the next new thing, I've been here too long. I have spent my life turning stories into song. I am not silver, I am not gold, no precious metal for you to mold. I am a river rock, tumbled smooth by the rush of life. This life I choose. I have come to see things through a prism lens as I make this journey closer to its end. At many times I'm troubled by much of what I see, but I won't waste my breath declaring you've done this to me. I am not silver, I am not gold, no precious metal for you to mold. I am a river rock, tumbled smooth by the rush of life. This life I choose. I am a river rock, tumbled smooth. This life I choose. Every step along the way, I made my own choice. I tried to choose the truth. That's how I found my voice. I am not silver, I am not gold, no precious metal for you to mold. I am a river rock, tumbled smooth by the rush of life. This life I choose. I am a river rock, tumbled smooth by the rush of life. This life I choose. I am a river rock, tumbled smooth by the rush of life. This life I choose. I am a river rock, tumbled smooth by the rush of life. This life I choose. I am a river rock, tumbled smooth by the rush of life. This life I choose.
The women of the suffrage movement were incredibly brave, unbelievably persistent, and absolutely unwilling to take no for an answer. And they got no, and no, and no, and no, and no.
The women of the suffrage movement were tenacious, they were courageous. They were women who were fighting against a system where everything was stacked against them. They really were told to sit down and shut up, but that is not what they were going to do.
If I were to describe them in one word, I would say fearless. They 100% were willing to take on this massive American institution that was men in politics.
The women of the suffrage movement had a degree of courage and optimism that is something that should be a model to all of us. We stand on their shoulders, and we have to recognize that we have people standing on ours as well, and would that we could draw upon their courage, their optimism, their determination, that they would succeed.
I do see myself in those characteristics. I believe I am determined, I am persistent, and I am ready to make a change in this world.
I think for anybody who wants to move the needle on rights and opportunities for people in this country, even a country that describes itself and embraces the fact that it's a democracy, you have to be willing to fight. You have to be willing to take those rights. You have to be willing to stand up and argue for those rights for yourself and for other people.
The fight for equality, for the right to vote, was 72 years long. It wasn't a short fight, and it wasn't one that many who started knew that they were going to be able to finish. But they did it anyway because they knew the importance to future women, to me, to my granddaughters one day, to the people who will come behind us.
I think they believed that in their core, that no matter what circumstance that they were in, that their voices should and would carry the power to be able to change things.
I think the word stubborn is a very gendered word, but I have learned to embrace it. I think that the women of the suffragist movement were extremely stubborn and refused to yield, and that is extremely important in how I see myself.
Oh, I'm definitely tenacious, like the women who were in the suffrage movement. I really am going to make my point. I'm really going to insist that justice be done. I'm going to speak up. I'm not going to let somebody tell me that blue is red and red is blue.
I think persistence and resilience is something I see in myself. Others might describe it as being pig-headed and not giving up. So I'm not sure it's always described in a positive way, but I don't mind.
I really believe those women paved the way for us to have our own voice. They spoke up, and I think they spoke up on behalf of us so that we would be able to have our own voice in this era.
Hey guys, it's great to see you, to reconnect in the cybersphere. I want to introduce you first of all because everybody needs to know who we're talking to. And I don't know if the world is seeing you in the same order that I am, but I've got Vivian Lee to begin, left to right, then me, I'm Roma Torrey, Kristen Shaughnessy, and then on the bottom two, Amanda Farinacci, followed by Janine Ramirez. You guys are just wonderful women. We're talking about a sisterhood, and you are definitely tops in my sisterhood, and it's always great to join you. When we talk about the theme of sisterhood, let's get to first our sisters deep down, but we're also working individuals. And I want to get a sense from any of you to share what a great, as a woman, what has been for you? What makes a good working situation? By the way, I can start for a second. For me, working in the newsroom has systems running at the same time, and there's this sense of teamwork, and everybody's doing what they're trained to do, and they're all achieving their strengths. You know, for me as an anchor, it's the opportunity to coordinate so many disparate elements, and when it all comes together, well, there's really no writing at that point if there's a live event, but taking the visuals and taking all of the graphics and whatever is on social media and being able to put it all together into a coherent report that informs our audience the best way we can. To me, it's like a symphony, and that's what makes a great workday. Whether we're talking about women or men, that to me is the ideal work situation.
Well, for me, I anchor, but I also am a reporter, so I'm out in the street a lot. And as a journalist, you're a storyteller. And a great day for me is really giving a voice to those people who don't have one, right? So television is a powerful medium, and those who see themselves on television or get their story or their message across on television, it empowers them. And so a great day for me is to tell that story that really brings out whatever issue it is that sort of, it elevates their story. And a lot of these people just don't have anywhere to go. They don't know how to get their story across. And so to be able to interview them, get their words, put it into a storyline, a 2-minute story, a powerful news piece, and get it out to the world. And now really, we work in New York City, but this story, because of social media, could be seen all over the world. So really the impact could be great when you tell a good story.
Just to piggyback on those, I'm sorry, Roma.
No, go ahead.
You guys sort of nailed it, Roma. You describing the live situation. As a reporter, you want to be the person who is taking the toss from you, who's watching and explaining the situation from the scene as it's unfolding. A lot of stress, but also like a lot of adrenaline and a lot of fun. And I know that sounds silly a little bit, but that's sort of the high that gets you through so many hours and so much stress and so much being so on. And then at the same time, I think that there's a nice balance being the person who gets the kind of a gut punch impact, where you are giving voice to people who don't have it, where you're raising an issue that hasn't been appropriately or adequately addressed before, and you're the person who found it, who researched it, who sort of like hit it, brought it all the way home. And so it is a different kind of fun, but also like you put the piece out there and then you sort of watch the ripple effect, right? And that's like, for me, where I get my highs, I guess. Yeah. Those are the good days.
Yeah, well, you know what it is? The whole notion of having a voice and being able to use our voice in a unique or powerful way really does make my day. But the other side of the coin, though, is that we talk about the suffragists and all that they managed to accomplish, that they gained a voice when they won the right to vote. But even today, 100 years later, a lot of women don't have a voice, or if they do have a voice, they don't use it to speak up. And so the other side of the coin is, have you guys ever experienced situations where you've been in a work situation and you were scooped, or because you were a woman, you were taken advantage of, or you had to defer to a male presence in the newsroom? Has that ever been your experience? And Vivian, let me start with you. Has that been something that you can share?
You saw me nodding, like
yeah.
It's happened on a couple of occasions in different jobs when I was much younger, and I had found a story. And there was one in particular that I remember. It was a story that another senior reporter had actually touched on, but I was updating it with a new development. So what that ended up happening, to my surprise, was a meeting was called with me, the senior reporter, and the managing editor. And the three of us kind of hammered it out. And I guess I felt the bull rising in me in terms of like a serious anger and some consternation that I was facing this in that day and age. And I pushed back. And I actually years old. And somebody who's more senior says, no, that was mine because I touched it several years ago. Is that reason enough to have that person continue to cover that story? And I remember the managing editor and I had a great relationship, and he agreed with me. He agreed that I should be able to take it. And I don't think my relationship with that more senior reporter was ever the same again, but that was an example of being big-footed. I think there was a gender-based impulse behind that treatment, and probably my age might have had something to do it. Maybe that senior reporter thought I was too much of a whippersnapper to try and take on a subject that reporter had already touched. So yeah, it's a very disheartening feeling, but it feels great when you stand up for yourself and fight back and prevail.
Yeah. Here, Vivian. Way to go. Yes. And have you had a similar experience?
You know, I can't think of like any specific example like Viv has had, but I think we've all just kind of run into roadblocks in our career where you can kind of feel the weight, where you have to find your voice and stand up. So,
Amanda, I think you once told me you had experienced something similar to that.
A couple of actually it's happened to me a lot of times where I delivered the sort of the original tip that led to the big story. I did the first big story, and then more resources or more help or more support went to a male who was either a political reporter or somebody that they deemed sort of quote unquote more appropriate. There were obviously some gender issues there that should pick up on the continuing, coverage of the thing that I first brought to the table. It's infuriatingly frustrating to feel like you have innovated something and you've brought and delivered something unique and amazing. And even if it's not really amazing, you just get that sort of high at knowing that you've done something, that you've brought something exclusive, or you've got a scoop, and then realize that like it doesn't matter. Even though you were the original, it's just going to go to somebody with, someone else that's probably not a woman or me.
All right, I'm going to describe a behavioral trait and tell me if this resonates at all with any of you. That women tend to be self-defeating, that they second guess themselves. They don't think maybe they measure up to some of their other colleagues, particularly male colleagues. And they often apologize for not being better. Is that something that any of you can relate to? Kristen, I see you smiling.
yeah, I mean, I think I had a really bad habit of saying sorry to the point where I recognized it, and I try not to do that anymore because I wasn't apologizing really. It was just sort of, that's a female thing to do. I think for a lot of women, maybe not for you guys, but so I had to break that habit. I think as you get older, you find your voice. And I always felt like I knew my voice, but you're also supposed to be polite, and you're supposed to have a certain temperament, and you're not supposed to push back. So that you have to find a way to do that, but still hold your ground, and still be, you can still be polite, but you got to hold your ground.
Yeah. But it seems like men don't care about that, right? Men don't care about being polite. They say what they need to say because they feel like they have the authority to say it. And women, when they second guess themselves, do I have the authority to say this? Should I be saying this? Should I weigh in? Should I just step back? Because you don't want to be deemed as, oh, she's such a bitch. She comes in there and she just, is trying to take over. And, it's just the whole other thing. It's being assertive versus being, like you're right, like a bitch. Like you just don't want to be in that category.
Yeah. So it's different labels, don't you think, Janine? In terms of, a woman is described one way and a man would be described as powerful. It's just, you're going to get if you do the same thing, you're going to get a different label if you're a female.
Right. Yeah. On this particular, but a woman's a diva, right? Like, right. Same idea.
One time I did a story, and it was written up. The press wrote up chatty. Would a man ever be described as chatty because I talked a lot during my live shots? Never.
They would be described as informative.
Right.
Yeah.
Authoritative. Yeah.
Well, and also
Authoritative.
men, when men are forceful, they're aggressive, and that has a positive connotation. When women are forceful, you said it, they're overly assertive, they're bitchy, and I wish we could change that perception in our own work situations, but also from the public, because I sometimes, and unfortunately through social media, people are just chime in anonymously and say, the most insulting things to me. But oftentimes they resent if I say anything that has, well, I hate to use a strong opinion. I don't render opinions, but if I call somebody out in an interview, for example, if they're lying or whatever, they jump down my throat. When a guy does it, they go, here, he's being tough. He's a great interviewer,
Right.
So
I think a lot of it starts with recognizing first how we all were raised and what generation we were raised by, and from what generation we belong to. Because I catch myself telling my daughters, keep your voices down. And it's funny because I've only in the last couple of years realized how much I heard that as a young girl. And I don't want to pass on to my daughters that they should not. Has a lot to do with how you're conditioned, like the level of volume that is considered appropriate for both boys and girls at this age. And I catch myself doing that. So now what I try to do is counter that by saying, okay, we are not in a place where we can use our outdoor voices. If you have something to say, ask for my attention first. Just say, please, Mom, can I say something? And I try to couch it in a different way, because that is definitely not something that I grew up with. And when I entered news, I kind of felt like this is a business where everybody's opinion helps to make the final product, and everybody's opinion will be valued and cherished, whether you say it privately, like in a story meeting, or publicly as an anchor or reporter. That is not the case. Even our own business is deeply affected by these generalizations that I think we all become socialized with.
100 years later, we're still dealing with it, right?
No, we are. And I can extend that socialization to, I think we end up giving the perception that we're undeserving of perhaps the money that we get or the accolades or whatever. And it goes back to that whole, we apologize too much. But I think oftentimes we feel that maybe we don't deserve the salaries that our male colleagues get. And I'm just wondering, have any of you experienced that, where you didn't fight for a comparable salary that you really did deserve, but you just felt like, well, who am I? I don't think I'm worth that much money, for example. Have you ever had that experience?
I actually did fight, and I asked for a lot more than I was making, just to let them know I knew what my worth was. I had also found out what the guys were making who had less experience and hadn't been there as often. And I think, Janine, you and I were the first ones to share our salaries. This was years ago, probably 20 years ago, maybe 19 years ago. And it was helpful because, we started knowing what people were making, what we were making, and it really helps you negotiate. And I will tell you what my brother-in-law, who owns a company, said. I've never had a woman come to me and ask me for a raise. Never.
Really?
25 years, 30 years.
The men do, right?
Men always do. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the women don't want to be seen as demanding, right? Oh, she's so demanding. But when men go in there being demanding, the same thing. It's like, that's okay. But for a woman, it's like, who does she think she is coming in here demanding A, B, and C? So it's the perception of when a woman asks for something versus what a man asks for something.
Yeah, I actually went into a contract negotiation a long time ago saying, I don't want to be greedy, and so.
And then they have you right there.
Total undermining of your worth, right?
Because it's not about greed.
Right.
It's about
Value.
pitting your worth based on your experience, where you've worked, what you've done, what you've achieved. That's not greed. I don't think a man would be accused of being greedy if he listed all of his accomplishments and where he managed to get them done.
Yeah.
It is the one area that can be an equalizer with an employer. If female colleagues or all colleagues share their salary, that makes you more powerful as a group.
Yeah.
And I think that you need that. Go ahead, Amanda.
When I was in high school, I worked at the Gap, and I worked with like 7 other friends. We all worked at the Gap. We all made like $12.50 an hour. We were all like very open about the fact that we made $12.50 an hour, and whatever. And then once you sort of get to the real world, people just stop, as women, just stop discussing it. And so you can enter into this sort of very lonely realm of, you feel happy that you have a job, especially we work in news in New York City, the #1 market. You feel grateful that you've made it. Like me, I started out here, so I wasn't coming in from someplace else. So I was just like, oh, wow, I'm here. I'm going to take whatever they offer. But I had literally not wanting to be demanding or oversell myself or price myself out. Meanwhile, I know there are males who have either less experience or as much experience who are making significantly more money than I am, and I have accolades. I have worked for 20 years, but it's all because we are preconditioned almost since we're from college, the age, to just sort of like, I've had the same best friends my entire life. We don't even talk about money, and that's just, we did before we were younger, but once you get older and things start to get more real, it just becomes an uncomfortable conversation, and that's really something that needs to change, because like the information is power. Like, I say to younger women now, like, guys, talk to each other and tell each other, because like, if you don't know what everyone else is doing, that's by design. That's meant to keep you at 80 cents or whatever on the dollar, right? I think it's the figure. That's purposeful.
If it's that, yeah, it might be 77.
It's already happening. There are people in their 20s who have told me, the new thing now is to tell each other what we're making, especially if we're all going for the same kind of job. And it's kind of smart, because then it completely neutralizes competitiveness and almost puts the issue squarely in the lap of employers.
Who are counting on not sharing. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I credit Janine for that, because I think you came to me, Janine, and I was like, you have to make a decision. Do you trust each other enough to do it? We didn't know we were friends, but we didn't know each other that well. We had both sort of started it. We weren't, and it was a really good, smart move on your part.
Well, I think a lot of times women have to bond together, and information is power, and you empower each other so that when you go in there for your negotiation, you kind of know, what your next move is. Like, what am I going to go in there and ask for this level, because I know, A, B, and C are making that, and I am in that category, and I should be at that level. And so to have that information, especially as a woman, because most of the time, the people that you're asking for a raise or a contract negotiation, they're men. And so the men are not, you're already like at a disadvantage as a woman, with men looking at, oh, she's going to be demanding, and she's going to try to sell herself, and I'm more powerful than she is. So you're already going in there in a vulnerable position. And so to have information, that empowers you.
And I will say, you should never be upset about if someone is making more than you shouldn't be upset about that, because that means you can make that too. That gives you a goal to reach for, and it only helps all women. For women, particularly when it comes to pay, the more somebody makes, you should be happy for them.
Yeah, I think part of the problem is the competitive culture of the workplace. And, maybe that's a generational thing, because I think young people are getting it now. They realize that there is power in sharing information. But for us, I have to be honest, I didn't want to reveal my salary, because I was afraid if that came out, then other people would want that salary. And then instead of raising others, I'd be lowered, as if there is a finite amount of money to be given out, and that we all have to share it, equally.
Right.
Guys never think of it that way, and that's part of the problem. And I think, we really do have to open up to one another, and make it and share that kind of information. That's really strong. The whole notion, though, of women in a workplace being supportive has always bothered me too, because a lot of times people will ask me, we have this lawsuit and they say, well, is your management male or female or whatever? And, granted, there are issues with male bosses, but women bosses can be equally unsupportive. And that has always struck me as so strange that women work against one another oftentimes when they're in leadership positions. And who've been actually worse than some of the male bosses. And they have judged us on our appearance. And, that's another area that, I think would be worthwhile to get into. The fact that we're in a business where we are judged based on cosmetics, hair, the wardrobe, the makeup, and all of that. And yet we're in a business that is all about imparting information, informing people. Men are not judged in the same way we women are. And so suddenly, and maybe this is and very pretty, the whole, the beauty queen syndrome. It's so frustrating to me as a woman that I have to look a certain way. I have to dye my hair. I can't go gray. There is pressure to Botox. By the way, I've not done it. Maybe I should say yet, but I really resist that whole cosmetic treatment there, surgical treatment. But what do you guys think about that? I mean, how frustrating is it to you that you have to go through all these machinations to look a certain way in order to be accepted on the job? Anybody?
I agree with you. I think the problem starts with the number of international, transnational media companies that are governed and led by men. I think there was a study put out some time ago that showed around the world there was like an appalling lack of female representation at almost every senior level of management in all the major media companies in America, and a few that were identified in Europe. There's that, as well as this seemingly age-old obsession with the idea that youth equals beauty, number one. And so what you need to do as a woman especially is preserve your youth as much as possible in order to at least start to fill in the equation that makes up and results in beauty. I think we are in a very optics heavy business. I think looking professional, looking like we take care of ourselves is a dominant kind of predisposition that I think every man and woman is subjected to when they enter any kind of business that puts them in the spotlight. However, there is much more leeway given to men to age, and that idea that they become more valuable as they age, the graying at the temples and maybe some more wrinkles on the face connote wisdom, experience,
gravitas,
but not the same to women.
Right.
And I think changing that, I know we had all had this discussion before, all of us, with, I think I had asked you all, when did you realize that you had to start taking extra measures to preserve this idea of youth? And you all came up with your own examples of it. And it was really kind of just like really upsetting to know that this was a shared experience among women. And our business is in a lot of ways perpetuating it. There was that anchor in Australia. I think it was like the Today Show in Australia, where he wore the same outfit, the same jacket. And just
been a couple of them, yeah.
Yeah, and that went viral, and it touched off so many conversations in media newsrooms and media pens when people were working out in the field, where it was so apparent that it was true. The man was not bothered for having worn the same blazer every day. And he himself even called out his industry for having a different standard set for women.
Mm. And if a woman wore the same color 2 days in a row, it would be like an epiphany.
Right. A woman has to have season-specific colors and textures.
Green yesterday. What are you doing?
And yes, you know what? I have subscribed to the pressure. I have a rotating wardrobe account. You know, I have not canceled it in this age of COVID. I've kept it. I'm only human, but I am aware that I'm under this pressure. I'm happy to discuss it out in the open because I think at least having that discussion about that double standard needs to start.
I agree. You know, we started talking about having our voice, and I want to end this with a discussion on what happens when you use your voice to speak up and defend your rights, and suddenly you're retaliated against, or you fear you're going to be retaliated against. Obviously, we did speak up, and we have experienced retaliation, but what advice do you guys have, or what can you impart to other women who maybe don't want to go the route, obviously, of you know, that extreme of filing a lawsuit, but how would you advise women who feel that they have been victimized in some way in the workplace and don't want their bosses to get away with it? What would you say to them?
Well, my new thing is document everything, because you know what? You go to your human resources department, and this is what really has, like, what I really learned throughout this whole process is that the human resources department really just works for the company. They work for the company. So they're really not looking out for an employee's best interest. They're really just, an internal investigation is for the company. So it's not, so I would just say just document everything for now, and kind of see if there's a pattern, see if there's other people within, you know, with colleagues that you could talk to, but to turn everything over to human resources or to somebody within the company who's really just protecting the interests of the company is not a good idea.
Mm. And I would say just do it anyway. I would say if you feel strongly enough about the wrong that's been, you know, done to you, then, and you are a woman who has XYZ set of beliefs, or and you feel like you know, we all have daughters, and we think about what comes in the future. I would say that, I mean, this, I speak for myself, but I think we all agree on this. This has not been easy. This is not an easy road to go down. It hasn't been, I mean, we've had some moments of fun, you know, lightness and laughter because we're friends, but mostly this has been really hard, but also really worth it. And I think that that's sort of the message that should be conveyed, is that anything worth changing is worth fighting for, and you do the work, because nothing easy ever, no big change ever comes easy, you know? And so it's scary. Yes. Retaliation stinks. Yes. Being looked at a certain way by people is not comfortable, but like, oh, well, you know, it's not comfortable not being treated nicely. When we were being mistreated, that wasn't comfortable either. So at least here we can stand up and say, you know, our back straight and hold our chins up high and feel like, you know what, I'm not going to be treated badly, and here's how I'm going to prove it to you. So, you know, there is a lot, I get a lot of strength from all of you, but also just like in knowing that if I was doing a story about this, I would commend the woman who spoke her mind and say, I'm so happy that I could give you the voice. Here's me giving myself that same courtesy. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I completely agree. And I mean, if you don't stand up, who is going to stand up? I think that's the question we all asked ourselves. And it's just going to continue and perpetuate if you don't stand up. And, you know, there's been a few, but not as a group. And it just became time. And at the end of the day, this is a huge issue. It is bigger than any of us. It affects, we have heard from women all over the world. So we know there's a problem, and it's time to just call it out and let the chips fall where they may.
And you know what, ladies, this is where sisterhood comes in, because, you know, we were talking earlier about the importance of sharing with one another. I don't think we would have gotten this far if we hadn't started to talk to one another and share our experiences and our feelings of being marginalized and sidelined in the office. And suddenly we kind of realized we were we were joined by a similar treatment, similar experiences, and that's what allowed us to come together. I don't think individually we would have gotten very far at all, but together, as the five of us, there is strength, and that's the value of sisterhood. So we can come full circle in this wonderful discussion with you, you four brilliant, beautiful ladies that I'm so proud to call my sisters. And you know what? I always end my little speeches or whenever I make any kind of presentation with that wonderful quote, strength to all women who feel that they need to speak up and they don't want to take it anymore. And the quote is always, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens, women, can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. So thank you all, and it's always an honor to share the same space with you, even if it is on a computer screen.
Right back at you, Roma.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Roma. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Faith Frazier, aka DJ Chocolate, international DJ and founder of Grown in Greek. Congratulations on the new platform. I'm so excited to see what's in store, and thank you so much for highlighting and empowering women all across the globe. Make sure you join the movement.
100 years since women earned the right to vote.
Absolutely.
And we're going to be celebrating it in a big way. What was your concept? What's your idea?
Well, nationally, this is a very, very big deal because it's the centennial celebration of the 19th Amendment, which is what the amendment in the Constitution that gave all the women the right to vote. And women have struggled for 72 years to get this right. And it really was remarkable because it's never easy. And I want to highlight and we want to just celebrate the nameless and the faceless because there are millions, gazillions of women who are in the movement that never get any of the credit. Of course, we know our iconic women, but it's really, really important that this is a celebration for all of us and that all of us can see ourselves somewhere in here.
To celebrate that right that people sometimes often take for granted is the reason that I wanted to help you and I wanted to be there. And you've got a great day planned. What's going to be happening for us in July?
So we have a couple of things. First of all, let me give a shout out to our legacy co-chairs. We're going to be welcoming the 3-time great-grandson of Frederick Douglass, the 3-time great-grandniece of Harriet Tubman, the great-granddaughter 3 times over of John Brown, as in John Brown at Harper's Ferry. And we have Manuela Roosevelt, who is the wife of David Roosevelt, who is the grandson of FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt. So
it's
really,
amazing, really. I mean,
it just gives you chills when you think about it.
CREWTV is a movement. We are civically re-engaged women, and this is the Seneca Falls Revisited virtual experience. It's CREW's Centennial celebration event commemorating 100 years of American women's right to vote. So go to crewwomen.tv to get your subscription today.
And an expert on women in politics. Yeah.
So this night's really exciting because Julie has a wonderful presentation that she's going to share with us. Julie, we're really excited to have her because not only is she an attorney and a constitutional law expert, but she also has done such tremendous work on women's advocacy. And I really asked her to sort of lasso the whole thing and compress it into like a half-hour, 45-minute presentation. And I mean, it's just amazing. So without any further ado, you're in for a big treat. I present Dean Julie Snook. Yay!
Thank you.
Graduate Center.
Yes. So thank you so much. And I do actually want to share with you why I am late this morning, because it ties into, I think, some issues with regard to women in politics. So I'm late this morning because of my duties as a mother. My son was signed up for an 11:50 audition at the National Opera Center around the corner from here. So I brought, he's a cellist in an orchestra. So I brought him over. And they said, didn't you get the email? We actually changed the location. He needs to be at 55th Street and 12th Avenue. And, I'd gotten him there early because I was going to come here at 11:45, just 1 block away. But things never work out. If they look like they're going to work out, timing, perfect. I had to run him up to 55th Street and then run back down here. And then there was a little bit of traffic. But I do think that it ties into, I think, a lot of women. I noticed one of my friends is actually running for office in Virginia. She's a law school classmate of mine, Larissa Couts. And she just got an endorsement by a group called Vote Mamas. And they
That's Lumia's group.
Yeah, and they support candidates recognizing some of the difficulties for women in politics, particularly women who have young children, not just in terms of discrimination or perceptions of women, which is also a huge set of issues, but also just of how do you do it all, and what difference does it make to the politics we have if we don't have women and mothers in political representation. And I want to start with, I know that the name of this course is Parity Politics. And parity is a term that's actually very important to a lot of the earlier work I did about constitutional amendments in European countries, including France, because it has a particular meaning in the European context, where when they talk about parity democracy, the idea behind parity democracy is that unless, this is the cabinet, Francois Hollande's cabinet when he was elected in 2012 in France, the idea is that unless you have at least 50% women in a leadership organization like the cabinet, there is something wrong. And there are certainly something wrong if you have a Congress or a Supreme Court or any political institution in a democracy that has no women in it, right? And this might seem obvious to us in a group like this, but we might actually start by asking the question, why? Like, what's wrong with not having any women? Why is it important to have at least some? Or why is it important to have half, or at least half women? And I think that once we actually start to answer that question, we see how complicated and slippery some things can be. What is, and it also raises this question of, well, what exactly is the relationship between women's participation in politics, creating bodies that are actually balanced, gender balanced, and problems of gender equality that are the subject of lawmaking itself. In the European context, this is one set of answers, right? Women are half the population. And what that means also is that women are not an interest group, right? There are a lot of groups that are lobbying for their interests, but you can't think of women that way because they're half the population. And what that means is that gender unequal institutions just lack the basic requirements of political legitimacy in a modern democratic society. And also, what's been very interesting in the context of parity movements in the European context is this idea that constitutions and constitutional amendments can play a really important role in expressing the principle that any democratic institution that's not gender equal is actually an illegitimate institution. And for over 100 years, both in the European context and in the United States, and actually longer than 100 years, women have participated in constitutional movements for gender equality around the world. A lot of attention is being drawn to the 19th Amendment, the movement for women's suffrage, because we have a centennial coming up. And it's worth noting that the United States is actually one of the few countries in the world that actually don't have a constitutional guarantee explicitly about equality for women, equality for men and women, or sex equality, or a constitutional provision that prohibits gender discrimination. We're one of the very few. Most constitutions in Europe, Latin America, Asia, they all have a provision that is about equal rights for women or non-discrimination on grounds of sex. And part of the explanation in the United States for that is that because of the groundbreaking work of women lawyers, like then Justice Ginsburg, who was a lawyer for the ACLU Women's Rights Project in the 1970s, that's her many decades ago, and of course there's now a film that portrays her struggles to get sex equality constitutionalized. And the strategy that was used in the 1970s was to argue that the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution, which includes a general equal protection clause, actually prohibited sex discrimination. So it's worth taking a look at what that says, right? That is, it doesn't talk about men, it says all persons, right? It says all persons, and it also says, so it says all persons are citizens of the United States, and which has long been understood to include women, even though it doesn't say so explicitly. And it prohibits denying to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And so the very important project throughout the 1970s was to argue that meant you could not discriminate on the basis of sex, that would be unconstitutional. Interestingly though, and this became a very important part of, that is, she's an iconic figure, not just a Supreme Court justice deciding cases about federal energy regulation and all that other stuff, but she's an iconic figure because we now understand the 14th Amendment as including women and including a prohibition of sex discrimination. But one puzzle or one difficulty that comes up in this arrangement
is Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, right? Nobody actually goes on and reads Section 2, and it's often thought to be kind of defunct as opposed to the Civil War thing. But what's very interesting is that it is the first time in the US Constitution that the word male gets used. At the same time that they say equal, they also then say, they're talking about the right to vote here. They say that if there is a denial of the right to vote only to the male inhabitants, then or an abridgment, then they're going to reduce the proportion of which the number of such male citizens shall bear to the whole number of male citizens in deciding how to apportion a district, right? So what they're saying is equal protection of the law, Section 1. Section 2, we're only going to count men when we decide how to apportion political districts, right? And so this is a puzzle because it suggests that the Equal Protection Clause didn't necessarily imagine women as being fully equal with men if they could, in the same breath, write something that looks like this. And of course, this got borne out in cases after the 14th Amendment because people like Susan B. Anthony and other women's suffrage activists believed that we could say that women had the right to vote under 14th Amendment, Section 1, equal protection. Privileges and immunities of citizenship. But the Supreme Court said, oh no, women are citizens under the 14th Amendment, but not all citizens have the right to vote, right? So there were cases that said that in this period, and that's why the 19th Amendment became necessary, where we had to make explicit that you couldn't abridge or deny the right to vote on account of sex. And of course, when we got the 19th Amendment, some of the proponents of the 19th Amendment, like Alice Paul in 1920, believed that the 19th Amendment was just one step in a larger package of constitutional change. And so after we got the 19th Amendment in 1920, she introduced and worked hard to draft the Equal Rights Amendment to the US Constitution. It was first introduced in 1923, but it really didn't go anywhere until 1972. In 1972, both houses of Congress adopted the ERA by 2/3 of a majority, and then under Article 5 of the Constitution, what then has to happen after both houses of Congress adopt by 2/3 majority is that it has to go to the states for ratification. You need 3/4 of all the states. What happened then was that we only got 35, and 38 is what you need to have 3/4 of the states. And so it stalled, and there was a deadline. The deadline was originally set for 1979, but then Congress extended the deadline to 1982. Didn't really matter, though, because no state ratified it after 1977. And so it stalled. The deadline came and went in 1982, and everyone long assumed that the ERA was dead. And it's important to understand why the ERA failed for our purposes. That's Phyllis Schlafly over there. She's sometimes credited with having single-handedly stopped the ERA, but I don't think anyone in American politics can do anything single-handedly. And I think Phyllis Schlafly succeeded in part because of her political genius in arguing that the ERA was actually going to be bad for women, and particularly bad for mothers. Right? And so you see this quote here. This wasn't during this period. I think she said this much later in a campus speech. Feminism has changed the way women think, and it has changed the way men think. But the trouble is, it hasn't changed the attitude of babies at all, right? And of course, this is very consistent with the arguments that she made in a huge Stop ERA campaign. She claimed that if you had constitutional equal rights for women, protections for mothers, would disappear, and women would actually end up being very disadvantaged if they chose traditional roles like motherhood or being a housewife. And you'll note, I mean, of course, there were a lot of men who helped to kill the ERA too, but I believe that she would not have been quite so successful if she hadn't appealed in her message with so many women across the country who were worried about the fate of motherhood and women's role as mothers under a regime of equal rights. And I believe that this is actually a central issue for women in politics. This is not to say that this is the only issue for women in politics, but I think without addressing and appealing to the problem of motherhood, it'll be very hard for any politics of parity, a politics that's not just about interest group politics, but women as half the population for that politics to succeed. And it's important to note that today, of course, and I'm talking about the ERA because it's actually back in contemporary debates. I would say its real comeback came with the Women's March, where the organizers of the Women's March actually mentioned the need for to revive the ERA and their unity principles. And then some very curious and interesting things happened. Nevada, which had previously rejected the ERA, actually ratified the ERA in March 2017. And I think a lot of, just like the Women's March, I think the new interest in the ERA was a reaction to the Trump presidency and the misogynistic political rhetoric that has been part of the Trump presidency. And then between 2017 and May 2018, when Illinois ratified the ERA, there I think we had the Me Too movement and a new energy around women in politics and women's issue in politics. So now we actually have 37 ratifications. So if we have one more state, we'll have 38, which is what you need for the ERA to become part of the Constitution. It's not a foregone conclusion, though, because of the deadline, there will be legal and political with regard to the validity of the two ratifications that we've already had, and the third, which I think is easily on the horizon in the next few years. So, and just getting back to what I was saying about the politics of motherhood, this actually really surprised me when I saw this statistic. But as it turns out, today, 86% of women have given birth by the time that they're 44 years old. And that's actually, and I guess, and I know I'm a mother, but in the circles that I move in, this seemed like a very high percentage to me. But in any case, it's an interesting one. This was a number that had declined actually from the 70s until around 2006, but it seems like it's climbing back up. And yeah.
So they're saying that women over 40 are having babies.
No, what they're saying, it's counting, if you count everyone who's now 44, have you ever given birth at all, right? It's not, have you given birth in your 40s, but have you ever given birth from, whenever you were of childbearing age until now? And that's to say that this is a very large majority of women in this generation who are actually mothers. And also, I mean, there's similar vast majority are also in the workforce. Central issue for how we make meaning out of what gender equality can and should mean has to address the problem of working motherhood. And if we want to think about what equal rights has traditionally meant, right? Under the frameworks that were developed in the 1970s by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, there was a real emphasis on prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sex, right? So you don't want the law to make distinctions between men and women or treat men and women differently. That is probably the most important contribution of Justice Ginsburg and the legal feminists who stretch the Equal Protection Clause to cover gender and discrimination against women. But I think it's also very important to note that if we're actually going to address the issues of working motherhood, the simple guarantee that there's no discrimination on the basis of sex is probably not enough. And the non-discrimination right has been really important. It's been very important for fighting stereotypes. It's also been very important for the general principle that all human beings should be free from irrational and bigoted forms of discrimination. So that's the idea of non-discrimination has also been extended now to many other groups, including LGBTQ individuals and various other vulnerable groups. And of course, the idea of non-discrimination was not invented in the United States with the idea of sex discrimination. It really originates in the concept of race discrimination, which is central to the way that the 14th Amendment has been interpreted really from the beginning. But at the same time, what I find really interesting here is that if it's true, so with so many women in the United States, very vast majority in our generation who have become mothers, it's really tragic that the ERA fails because it's seen to be unfriendly to mothers, right? the interests of wives and mothers were deployed as a way of arguing against something that's obviously about, or should be about, the emancipation of women. And I want to mention where I started, that in most other countries in the world and in many European countries, the rights of mothers, or the protection of motherhood, or the state support of motherhood, has actually gone hand in hand with the constitutional meaning of the guarantee of sex equality that you find in European constitutions worldwide. So I want to say a little bit about that. And perhaps the best way to think about it is by coming back to the 14th Amendment for a moment, right? Because we mentioned that even though it says equality, there seems to be a refusal in Section 2 to recognize women's fully equal status with men. And so why? Why does the 14th Amendment not guarantee totally equal legal status to women? Is it just an accident, or is it a deliberate exclusion? And I think that it's not that simply that the drafters, who are mostly or all male, forgot that there were women. Yeah, go ahead,
Wouldn't
Chair.
it be also a matter of economics?
Mhm.
Because the federal government has a proportional dissemination of funding to the states. So therefore, if you have your smaller and your larger states, so therefore if you count people differently, like creative accounting, the federal government doesn't need to subsidize in the same proportional kind of way, because it's creative math, so to speak.
Yeah, well, absolutely. So when we talk about Section 2, they're really talking about punishing. I mean, what this section is really about is punishing certain states that deny the right to vote to the newly enfranchised African Americans, right? And one question is, though, but by framing that, they really make it clear that they're the only holders of those rights, or the only people who count, are men, and expressing then, of course, our whole constitutional framework that exists until now. Women are citizens, but we don't assume that women are fully equal legally or in status to men. Why not? I mean, part of the answer has to do with the implications of what it would mean in, like, with regard to the right to vote and apportionment. But I think there's a deeper and more general set of issues with regard to women's exclusion from full legal and political equality at this moment, which the Supreme Court addresses.
It's a touch screen.
Okay, there we go. In the first set of cases in 1873 that actually interpret the 13th and 14th Amendments, the Civil War amendments from the US Constitution. So this is a notorious case, Bradwell versus Illinois. Myra Bradwell had studied law and kicked butt on the bar exam, but the Illinois Supreme Court said she could not be admitted to the bar because she was a woman, or the state of Illinois excluded married women from admission to the bar, even if they passed the exam. And the US Supreme Court explains that even though we have the 14th Amendment, practicing law is not a privilege and immunity of citizenship. And what's interesting, so they say it's fine for states to deny women entry into the legal profession, right? It's not unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment, equal protection, privileges and immunities, whatever language in the 14th Amendment you're going to look at. And one of the justifications for this, though, is that you can't have women who have fully equal status because women are actually subsumed by the legal status of their husbands. And it has to be that way. Women cannot make and enforce contracts because what would happen if women made and enforced contracts? And Justice Bradley's concurring opinion, more so than the majority opinion, really lays out the logic behind this position. So if you look at what he says, the civil law, as well as nature herself, has always recognized a wide difference in the respective spheres and destinies of man and woman. Man is or should be woman's protector and defender. The natural and proper timidity and delicacy which belongs to the female sex evidently unfits it for many of the occupations of civil life. The constitution of the family organization, which is founded in divine ordinance as well as in the nature of things, indicates the domestic sphere as that which properly belongs to the domain and functions of womanhood. okay? And I'm going to ask you to try, okay, so we're going to do an exercise. Try to ignore the sexism of the quote for a minute. I know it's hard, but try to ignore the sexism for a minute to try to make sense of the worldview, right? Because I don't think the worldview is just sexism, although that's a huge part of it. If you look at what he then continues to say, the harmony, if not to say identity of interests and views which belong or should belong to the family institution, is repugnant to the idea of a woman adopting a distinct and independent career from that of her husband. So firmly fixed was this sentiment in the founders of the common law that it became a maxim of the system of jurisprudence that a woman had no legal existence separate from her husband, who was regarded as her head and representative in the social state, right? And so I want to talk a little bit about what this means, because I think we often look at it and just see, oh God, there's divine ordinance sexism, like it's just a bunch of drivel and we don't need to pay attention to it. But I actually think what he's saying is actually quite important, because women's exclusion in the 14th Amendment has to do with what is the society's plan for how to raise the next generation of citizens. The plan is women stay home and take care of the household, and men go out and have a legal existence and make and enforce contracts and vote and run the polity, right? Because every society has to have a plan by which the next generation gets raised. This is our plan, right? And of course, part of the justification then for excluding women is that if every constitutional system is actually interested not just in setting up institutions, but setting up institutions for a society that plans to perpetuate itself, because a constitution, of course, is supposed to outlive the people who are writing it. It creates fundamental law that's transgenerational, right? And so this is the society's plan for how we're going to perpetuate ourselves. Of course, it's gender unequal, but it's a framework that works in the sense that if you keep women at home and men in economic and political life, it is a system that is going to ensure that somebody's around to raise and educate those kids. And of course, a lot of this changes, right? That is what our plan becomes. And of course, but the fear here is what's going to happen to this plan if women start enforcing contracts and getting jobs and becoming lawyers and being in Congress, right? Then our plan is going to fall apart. Then who's actually going to raise the children, right? And so that's why we have to keep the plan intact. And of course, this also then draws attention to the huge problem with anti-discrimination as a solution. We can wake up today and call mothers and fathers equal, right? We could say they now have legal rights. Or we could say get rid of the sexism. But it doesn't necessarily mean that by saying everyone's equal, you're then going to have a new plan that works pretty well and is up and running without a lot more work thought into how we're going to construct that plan. And I think this comes into sharper focus if you look at 20th century constitutions, particularly the ones that grew up in Europe after World War I and World War II. Because after World War I and World War II, one fundamental problem, well, there were many, but one huge problem in World War I and World War II in countries like Germany was that the male population had been decimated. And because so many men were dead, it became really clear that women actually had to do everything. They had to work and raise children at the same time in order for the nation to be able to rebuild itself. And because they kind of understood that, and you see it very clearly in the Constituent Assembly debates, gender equality becomes a fundamental political principle. And it doesn't just mean non-discrimination. It kind of also means we need a new plan for how this nation is going to get rebuilt. And so if you look at, for example, and what's interesting also after World War I and World War II, is that starting with the German Constitution after World War I in 1918, there are actually many more women in the German Constituent Assembly in 1918 than there are in 1948-49. In 1948-49, there were only 4 women, largely because it's a much smaller Constituent Assembly. The one that wrote the Weimar Constitution after World War I was actually much larger, had hundreds of people in it, and 10% were women. You have 4 women in in writing the German Basic Law, which is the constitution that's currently in force in Germany. These women came from all sides of the political spectrum. So socialists, Christian Democrats, and what's very interesting also is that it's not partisan politics in terms of their advocacy for constitutional sex equality, as well as the advocacy for other provisions that are in the Constitution. And I think it's important to note, and if you want to know a little bit more about their work, I highly recommend this made-for-television German movie that dramatizes their experience of getting gender equality into the German Constitution. It wasn't an easy feat. And so, there's pop culture with RBG in the movies here and the German founding mothers in their movies. And I highlight the German example because what's very interesting is not only that they wrote a provision in 1994 that said men and women shall have equal rights, and then in 1994 they added an amendment that you see in blue that the state shall promote the actual implementation of equal rights for women and men and take steps to eliminate disadvantages that now exist. Right? That's a late 20th century intervention. But if we're just looking also at the post-war experience, 1949, when they write men and women shall have equal rights, they also write this provision into law. And this becomes a very common feature of constitutions around the world. Section 6.4, every mother shall be entitled to the protection and care of the community. Right? In Germany, they see equal rights for women as going hand in hand with making sure that mothers get the protection of the community because of this understanding that they need a new plan. If you're going to actually rebuild a nation after war, women are going to work and have kids, and there needs to be some state support for that new arrangement that's different from the arrangement that's celebrated in the Bradwell versus Illinois case. And I just also want everyone to know that we're not to explicitly mention gender, sex, even pregnancy and marital status, sexual orientation, these categories, gender categories in constitutions. So this is the Constitution of South Africa, the Constitution of Ecuador, which is a 21st century constitution, have a provision that specifically refer to equal rights for male and female citizens. There's another provision in addition to that prohibits discrimination, and you'll notice there are many categories of discrimination, not just sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, but also things like cultural identity, socioeconomic condition, HIV carrier, disability. They list many different forms of discrimination that are prohibited by the Constitution. But in addition to that, there's also something special in the Constitution for mothers, right? So Article 43 in the Ecuador Constitution also says that pregnant and breastfeeding women have special rights. Free maternal health care services, facilities needed for recovery after pregnancy and during breastfeeding. These are all constitutional rights in Ecuador. And I give you these examples because I think it's important to reflect on all the different ways in which constitutions think about problems of gender inequality as both problems of discrimination on the one hand, and also problems having to do with lack of support for the sources of women's disadvantage. And sometimes that lack of support is itself a form of discrimination, but in my view, it's not really just discrimination that's the problem, but it's our inability to have created political and social institutions that actually deliver a plan for social and biological reproduction, how we're going to raise the next generation. The old plan that we can sort of make fun of in the Bradwell decision is mom at home. But we actually have not, now we've just said that's sex discrimination to say mom at home, but we haven't actually gone the step further of creating the social and political institutions necessary to have something other than mom at home as our plan. And what that means is that if you don't have something other than mom at home, we revert back, and women, by virtue of maternity, end up being severely disadvantaged, both politically and economically. And I think that's something to which there ought to be a solution that should not be partisan. This is something that should be of interest to women on all sides of the political spectrum. And just to give an example, this is not a constitutional example, but I think it's quite telling that a few years ago, 2015, the Supreme Court decided a case called Young versus UPS. And it was a case in which a woman who was pregnant asked for light duty, an accommodation, and she didn't get it. She wanted to, she had to do a lot of heavy lifting in her job, and she wanted an accommodation during her pregnancy where she would only be lifting things under 20 pounds. And UPS refused to give her that accommodation, and she sued, claiming that it was pregnancy discrimination. And it may seem like a no-brainer to you that she should get the accommodation, but it was actually a very complicated question under the pregnancy discrimination law that we have in the United States, because we just have to treat pregnant women the same as the way we would treat anyone similarly disabled or similarly able or unable to work. And the question is, if an employer then refuses light duty to everyone, then it's okay for the employer to also refuse light duty to the pregnant worker. Her case is complicated by the fact that there are some men who are getting light duty, and those are the ones who are injured on the job. And the employer is claiming, if you get injured on the job, then of course we give you light duty. But if you get injured off the job, like you get pregnant or you get into a skiing accident, then we're not going to cover that. We're not going to accommodate that, right? So it's a complicated case, but what I want to point out about the case, without getting into the details of the anti-discrimination framework that the court analyzes there, what I found most interesting about the case was the way in which it brought both feminist groups, women's rights organizations, in support of the pregnant worker, as well as pro-life conservative groups in support of the pregnant worker. And the logic is simple. If women are disadvantaged by virtue of maternity, they are going to be incentivized to just not have children and get abortions, or even before we think about abortion, just not reproduce at all. If becoming a mother is actually an economic disaster for those who choose to become mothers. And I think this just shows the extent to which concerns about social reproduction should be a bipartisan issue. It's not an interest group issue, but it's something that I think can and should unite women in politics from across the political spectrum, as it has in many other countries where constitutional equal rights movements have actually been successful, unlike ours. And I want to just kind of end by bringing it back to local politics, because I know many of you are running for positions locally or at the state level. You'll notice that Governor Cuomo made a statement in March on International Women's Day saying that it is unacceptable that more than 100 years after women won the right to vote in New York State, our Constitution still does not ban discrimination based on sex or afford women equal protections under the law. That needs to end this year. We must pass the ERA this legislative session to ensure New York continues to serve as the beacon of progress for this nation. So even though New York ratified the federal Equal Rights Amendment in the 1970s, New York never actually added an Equal Rights Amendment to the New York State Constitution. What we have in the New York State Constitution right now just says no person shall, because of race, color, creed, or religion, be subjected to any discrimination in his or her civil rights. But it doesn't mention sex or gender. And there is now a bill, and it actually passed the Assembly quite recently. It was sponsored by Assemblywoman Rebecca Seawright. And it's a very simple bill that just adds one word to what we already have in the New York State Constitution. So it inserts the word sex, which I put in red there so that you could see what the constitutional change will be. But meanwhile, it hasn't passed the Senate. In the Senate, I've been involved with Liz Krueger's office. Liz Krueger's the state senator who's been working and sponsored this bill. This is the existing bill, and there are other drafts that I've been on the team of attorneys working on. But another draft, another possibility is to have something much more expansive, sort of like the examples from Ecuador that I showed you. Equality of rights shall not be denied or abridged because of race, color, creed, religion, national origin, citizenship, marital status, age, gender, sex, pregnancy, sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression, physical or mental disability, other immutable or scriptive characteristic, or like grounds for discrimination, exclusion, or disadvantage, right? So this is what's known as the more expansive ERA. And you can try to think about, as a woman in politics, And I think the solidarity with all the vulnerable groups is extremely important. On the other hand, this has this kind of simplicity of saying we need to add sex to a framework that already has race in it. And I guess I would also just perhaps leave you with this, or we could use it as a topic for discussion. What are the relative advantages or disadvantages of focusing on sex or gender, or focusing on women even, versus focusing on all the different categories and groups with which women can be in solidarity. And so I think that one of the virtues of focusing on sex is that it really draws attention to the uniqueness of gender exclusion in the constitutional framework. That is, it's not just any old form of discrimination, or it's unlike other forms of discrimination in that it was actually a plan for how to grow the nation. Right? It is, so if you think about sex discrimination as not just being about sexism, but about having a set of social arrangements, and then you see sex equality as not just end the sex bigotry, but a sex equality as a commitment to having new institutions that reconfigure what our social reproduction framework looks like, right? That makes it extremely different from almost everything else, although arguably it makes it very similar to race. Because if you think of race as not just being about bigotry, but about the economic system of slavery and Jim Crow, right? Slavery and Jim Crow was absolutely 100% about bigotry, but it lasted for as long as it did and was sustained by people who did not think they were bigots because it was an economic framework by which the nation had a plan for survival. It was not a very, it was an immoral plan based on exploitation, but the idea is that it's been a framework rather that goes beyond discrimination and bigotry. And so if you think about it in those terms, you might think that having these kind of limited lists of prohibited categories makes more sense for a constitutional regime. And on the other hand, individual is entitled to be judged on their own merits without regard to a lot of irrelevant characteristics then the solidarity with all these other vulnerable groups that are differently situated with regard to the sources of their vulnerability in a diverse democracy. Perhaps this would be the more preferable framework. I will note one thing, though, and it's something that you see at work every time people have a discussion of the so-called inclusive ERA, right? This may look like a really exhaustive list to you, but if you compared that to this, right, you'll notice that in New York, nobody has really inserted socioeconomic condition or migratory status into the New York version, right? And it's not simply because we have forgotten. I think in part it's because sometimes there's an interest group politics that drives which groups get included and which don't get included, right? And if we really stick to the idea that really the constitutional prohibition of discrimination on grounds of sex or the constitutional rights of women should not be regarded as an interest group issue, but is actually something fundamental about women as half the population and women's role in reproducing the nation or reproducing the polity, reproducing New York, that might give us reasons to really focus on women's issues and appreciate the distinctiveness of those issues while also remaining in solidarity with all the other vulnerable groups that deserve legal protection. So I will just end there and open it up for discussion or questions. Yeah.
One quick question. The young lady.
Inside, you're the driving force.
for me to love and care for me when skies were gray. Whenever I was down, you were always there. Else can be what you have been to me. You will always be. You will always be the girl in my life for all time. Mama.
Fans, this is Sharon Nelson from CREW, Civically Re-Engaged Women, sitting here talking with Jennifer Rajkumar. Jennifer, we're so excited about your campaign. The young ladies that are watching this are really excited because they hope to one day run for office. So tell us, how's it been so far?
It's been never a dull moment, and I think all the girls should do it. I think that we are the future. We need more women doing this because we're still underrepresented at every level.
Exactly. And Jennifer, I want to tell you we're so proud of you because you're just getting in there and you're doing it strong. And Southeast Queens is where you're running.
Yes.
What made you pick this area?
So my family's originally from South Queens, and it's where so many immigrant families first launched from.
Okay.
And then I went all around the country in search of opportunity. And I came back to my roots to uplift the rest of our communities so we can navigate America.
Beautiful. And we're here at the opening of your office. Very, very exciting. I mean, it's beautiful. I mean, the space is great.
Thank you so much.
And you're so nice to feed folks and just really wonderful. Good music playing in the background. How'd you find this place, this particular campaign location?
Just by being really connected to the neighborhood, you learn where the spots are. And so we knew this was the hot spot, and we're going to be in the hot spot because we're a hot campaign.
Good. And it's in good traffic area and everything.
Yes.
Very easy to find. So definitely did good homework on that.
Thank you so much. And we have attracted all the celebrities like you, Sharon Nelson. So we've done pretty well
You're kind, my dear. Tell me, what do you enjoy most about running for office?
I enjoy meeting the people most of all. Because when I go door to door, immigrants who want to succeed in this country, I just meet so many people, and it's those stories that keep me going. It's the single best part of campaign.
Okay, well, wonderful. What we're going to say, we love your literature. Here's her lip. You see, everybody, literature, very important.
Very important.
Okay, but I thank you so much for giving us this opportunity.
Thank you.
Best of luck, my dear. And
I'm here to help. I'm here to help all the women. I'm in your corner, so please reach out. I'm here for you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer.
We are in Saratoga Springs celebrating the 100th anniversary of the women's right to vote, very close to where that movement all started.
My name is Elena. What's your name? My name is Michaela. Thank you. You too.
Women are coming together to really celebrate our empowerment, the right to vote, and map out a plan for the future.
This conference, more than any other conference I've been involved in, brings together an incredibly diverse group of people that are eager to talk to each other and eager to listen to each other.
Begins, and I was in the first graduating class. All right. Yeah.
So this is a photo of my great-great-grandmother. This is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Young women feel empowered today because if they look backwards, they'll find out that they're standing on the shoulders of the women's movement. Breaking the bronze ceiling over Central Park, and we're putting the first statue of real women in the park. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Sojourner Truth.
That's wonderful.
They all fought for women's rights. Ceiling. And whether it's in your office space, whether it's in an inappropriate relationship there, whether you check and find out that you're being paid less for the same job, you either accept it or you do something about it to change it.
History isn't what happened, it's who tells the story. We're moving away from the great white men, great wars, great dates history. And that requires that we repopulate history with all of the voices. Then we begin to know what we're celebrating, what we're commemorating. It was not a perfect movement. These women pushed democracy forward, but they did it at the expense sometimes of African American and other women of color. They made the argument, give women the vote, because white, native-born women outnumber Negroes and immigrants, and women's suffrage is a way to maintain white, native-born supremacy. How many years have we not had the multiplicity of voices that it takes to make good decisions that are in the interest of everyone?
I love the dresses.
Isn't it amazing what they've done with the hair? In the 19th century, there was a burgeoning of all kinds of experimentation, esoteric religions, there was spiritualism, there was theosophy. This new religious voice opened the door for women's leadership in churches and other religious organizations that then gave them the tools so that they then could organize women for the vote. It was really about thinking about your own calling, your own conscience. Women's freedom of conscience was connected to women's liberty, and women's liberty was also connected to the anti-slavery movement.
In April of 1888, he was giving a speech in Washington, D.C. He was reflecting on his time in Seneca Falls in 1848. He said, "When I ran away from slavery, I did it for myself. When I fought for abolition, I did it for my people. But when I was at Seneca Falls and fought for women's rights, there was some nobility in for of the vote to elevate his people, but also to protect his people from being brutalized, dehumanized, and lynched." And when I think about what Frederick Douglass and the abolitionists and what they were up against, imagine living at a time to teach you. I think that many people would run away from that challenge, and thank goodness he and many others didn't, or we would be a very different country today.
Driving to the 19th Amendment. Use it. We will. For so long, we have just been consumers of technology and not the producers. We must insist that in every arena, in every boardroom where technology decisions are made, that women have voice. What would happen if all of these voices could come together to unify behind issues that are important to women, and then work together in order to find solutions, either through our legislations or through our own sources of empowerment? The early love. Slave-born. Don't sit down and wait for opportunities to come. Get up and make them. Thank you, Sarah Breedlove, Mac Williams, Davis Walker.
As women, elevating our voices, what do you think would be our goal within the next, let's say, election cycle?
We talk a lot about gender parity, and I think that means all women have
accurate representation in all legislative bodies. And so I'm completely behind the energy to get more Republican women in Congress, to get more unaffiliated and independent women and more women of color. Because I think it's really only when people see themselves in government that the government really can thrive.
And we need to galvanize the inspiration of our young people, our girls, our young women, to be better, to have ambition, to demand more.
Starting this fall 2019, there will be 19.2 million college students in this country. Out of those, more than 11 million, a little more, 11.2, are women. If all these young ladies, these women, went out and voted, then we would see men and women in office who represent what matters to us as women. We're going to have our reproductive rights protected. We're going to have equal pay. We're going to have childcare.
Keep on representing, baby. We're going to ignite their minds.
Ignite their minds.
Their passion.
Their passions.
Let them feel it, understand it, explore it.
I would describe the character of the women in the suffrage movement as relentless and courageous. These women were not playing.
I had no idea that women had spent 2 weeks in prison because they were protesting, as is their right, in front of the White House. The women were tortured and chained. Why? When quitting would be so much easier, when everyone would fully understand if you just stopped and did the easy thing, which would be to walk away and not fight for your rights. And they didn't give up. They just didn't quit.
I'm inspired by all of them, but Inez Milholland died at age 30 on the public stage. She collapsed during a speech she was giving in Los Angeles. She accomplished so much, and she pushed the movement forward, and she was the icon of the movement. She was on the white horse, holding a flag that that said, "Forward to the light," and I think that she's just who you think of when you think about a suffragist.
If I could travel back in time and talk with any suffragist, I would pick Susan B. Anthony. She was certain that women would get their rights, but she was also very fearful that people, especially young women, would quickly forget what it took to get the right to vote.
She voted in the presidential election in the 1800s. She was arrested, and she insisted upon a trial because she wanted it to become part of the public record that she was being punished for exercising what had been a fundamental right. I think she was fined, but I do believe I read she never actually paid the fine.
I would love to tell her that after elections today, men and women make this sort of pilgrimage to her grave, and they put their "I voted" stickers on her headstone. And that she hasn't been forgotten, and the work and the risks that she and generations of women took has not been forgotten.
If I were talking to a suffragist and I were going back in time and sitting down with a suffragist today, I would thank her for putting her life on the line to make sure that future generations had full citizenship rights. I would tell her that we are really trying to carry that torch, that we are not going to sit down, that we are going to take the spirit that they created for us and push it forward, and we are persisting.
CREWTV is a movement. We are civically re-engaged women, and this is the Seneca Falls Revisited virtual experience. It's CREW's Centennial celebration event commemorating 100 years of American women's right to vote. It takes place on July 23rd through the 25th of 2020. So go to crewwomen.tv to get your subscription today.
is this a good time for drinking? Like, is this a renaissance? Like, absolutely, it's a revolution is what it is. Everything's changed. So there's something that I'm just gonna call before the cocktail, BC, right? And really that's just thousands of years of human experience making mixed drinks, whether it's 6,000 years ago, rice distillate, hawthorn berries, all this junk thrown together, but it was a mixed drink, right? Greek drinks where they'd mix it with like feta cheese and wine, all the way to like punches and colonial drinks like syllabubs and rattle skulls and all these pretty awesome but weird drinks. Then the cocktail comes along. It's first defined in print in 1806, and it's like lightning. There's something about the cocktail that's so beautiful and simplistic. Its form is perfect, and it's sugar, water, bitters, and spirituous liquor of any kind. Before that, certainly some drinks like that existed, but this is like an individualized drink. Now that golden age extends all the way to Prohibition. An entire country that can't agree on anything, an entire legislature that, you know, just gets ground to a halt when they have to like figure out any little detail. All of a sudden, you know, they agree, yeah, drinking's bad. It's like remarkable how this happened. And it really had to do with so many different things. Anti-immigration, women's suffrage, religious conflicts, everything just fed into it. Coming out of important. My grandmother, her era, 1950s. And she said, well, when people would come over to parties, I would serve them a Manhattan or a gin martini. If they didn't like a gin martini, then they got or serious cocktails in a not so serious environment. Then the Mad Men era. We all era of our time. Like, I mean, what awful political sentiments, but the drinking was cool and the style was cool. And then we get up to this, sometimes referred to as the Dark Ages, the 70s, disco. And what is cool at that point can't be your grandfather or your father's old fashioned, right? Like the Mad Men went from this real stylistic, cool era to like, those old guys? No, we're not drinking that. We are smoking pot, we are doing LSD. We're not concerned with alcohol. Then you get in the 80s and it's like really angular drinks that are like fluorescent colors, you know, blue, green. Oh, who cares? It just means substance. From 90s to 2000, you see this renaissance of cocktail bars and cocktail bartenders, and all of a sudden, everyone started to look at it and go, cocktails are cool. 10, 20 years later, it's everywhere. Everyone's expected to make a good cocktail. And so when you look at the context of alcohol and you look at its long past with humanity, you realize that it's something that has a special status in our culture and in cultures past. And we're in not the golden age, we're in the platinum age.
Good evening. Tonight's program is one of many inspired by our exhibition, Spirited Republic, upstairs in the Lawrence O'Brien Gallery. If you haven't seen it yet, I urge you to return and have a look. To learn more about the fashions of this lively era, let's get right to our discussion.
We're thrilled to be here. We're talking about Prohibition-era fashion.
World War I was over and everyone just started to party.
I would have, certainly. Absolutely. So we have Charleston dancing near the Capitol. What's going on here?
Well, all these modern dances had already started before the war, But then they really took off in the 20s.
So during the war, people felt that they needed to exercise some restraint.
Theoretically. Came back. In Atlantic City, as you know, the whole business with bathing suits caused a huge scandal. They were arresting people for wearing bathing suits that didn't have a long enough skirt, and gals who were not wearing stockings.
What? Stockings with the bathing suit?
Right. So there was one woman from California.
And a corset too?
Well, only the older ones were wearing the corset and the long dress, but the younger ones were wearing things like this. But it had to be long enough. It couldn't be without the skirt. The Annette Kellerman style got them arrested. And it was so unjust because while they're arresting people for wearing this on the beach, they're having these commercial beauty boardwalk festivals where the girls are strutting back and forth in the Annette Kellerman skirtless bathing suits with no stockings or stockings rolled all the way down, but that made money for all of the boardwalk executives.
Isn't it interesting, though, for all of us to look at this and reflect upon where we used to be and think of where we are today? I mean, I'd like to arrest a few people today. Don't mind at all. That's fascinating.
Well, they did have a few conflicts with men, too, because
what were the male conflicts?
The men wore a bathing suit, which was briefs, but also a top. And once in a while, some daring person would take off the top, and he could be arrested for that.
Good heavens. Well, I'll say about myself, the only way that I'll go to the beach is if I'm in what is it called? A Victorian bathing tent? That's the only way still. And some menswear.
Oh, yes, we had fun with the menswear. I mean, again, it was like we were, determined not to wear. Dynamic of sort of shifty characters who were coming newly into wealth and were very much about presentation. They, our Nucky, when he walked on the boardwalk, he wanted everybody to know that he was on the boardwalk. So we dressed him appropriately. And this is Chalky White, who is sort of the black counterpart to Nucky. Photography and film were both so huge, so people were much more conscious of their image. And presenting an image, and that it was actually going to be documented. So with Nucky, we always made sure that he was presentable and ready to be,
I think these clothes are great.
These are really great.
Yeah. Thank you.
The menswear is also amazing. We tend to forget that, but it's so fascinating.
Yeah. Well, again, that speaks to the young men coming back from the war and just not wanting to have anything to do with the older generation.
It's so different than Edwardians, much stiffer and more
color.
uptight, and this is just so
exuberant.
Exuberant, exactly.
Yeah.
So that is our look back at the 20s with Valerie and John, and we're going to have a little fashion show.
Yes, hurrah!
Oh my God, our first model this evening is Andy. Andy, come on out. So Andy is wearing an early 1920s mid-lightweight salmon-colored herringbone tweed suit. And this suit is comprised of a single-breasted jacket with patch pockets and matching plus fours. Plus fours are a variation on knickers and are comprised of a 4-inch fold over the knee. Knickerbockers or knickers were popular sportswear for many young gentlemen. The suit was made by Marley Clothes and tailored by the Syracuse Clothing Company. And also, this suit was used during season 4 of Boardwalk Empire, and it's part of Andy's own personal collection. Thank you, Andy. So Lori Crandall, come on out. Lori is wearing this absolutely remarkable casual day dress in silk crepe from 1922. It's adorned with fuchsia panels with colorful peasant-type hand-stitched embroidery.
Good evening. Thanks for your patience. I'm Tom Nastic, Public Program Producer for the National Archives, and I'd like to welcome you to the McGowan Theater at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and a special welcome to those watching on C-SPAN as well as on the National Archives YouTube channel. We're very pleased to present tonight's discussion on the historic connections between the temperance and women's suffrage movements of the late 18th and early 20th centuries, or 19th and early 20th centuries. Tonight's distinguished panel is moderated by Paige Harrington, Executive Director of the Sewell Belmont House and Museum, and includes Dr. Rosalind Terborg Penn, University President Emerita, Morgan State University, Lori Osborne, Archivist and President of the Francis Willard Historical Association, and Christina Myers, Program Director at the Alice Paul Institute. The program is presented in celebration of Women's History Month and in conjunction with the National Archives exhibit, Spirited Republic, Alcohol in American History, now on display upstairs in the Lawrence F. O'Brien Gallery. Before we get to tonight's program, I'd like to tell you about a couple of other programs we'll be presenting in this theater. On Tuesday, April 7th at noon, historian Terry Alford will be here to discuss his book, Fortune's Fool, The Life of John Wilkes Booth.
Hi, I'm U.S. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand. In 2020, we are going to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the passage and ratification of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote in our country. And all of you who are following in the footsteps of the incredible New York suffragists who made this happen. Women like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, who showed the nation that women and girls' voices truly matter. Please accept my best wishes for a wonderful event.
The 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, became enshrined in our Constitution. I, Mother, stand before you today as a candidate for the Democratic nomination for the presidency of the United States of America.
The Equal Rights Amendment, when ratified, will help knock down those restrictions that have locked women in to the old stereotypes of behavior and opportunity. It will help open up more options for women.
What about the youth vote? We heard so much after Parkland and the March for Our Lives movement. They were really motivated. Are they really?
So there's two ways to look at that. The glass half full version says that, yes, they are turning out in larger numbers than they have in previous elections. The glass half empty side, though, says that they're still underperforming. Let me give you an idea. 18 to 24-year-olds represent 8.9% of all registered voters, yet only 4.2% of them have voted so far. 18 to 34-year-olds represent about 26% of all registered voters, but only 12% have turned out.
A July analysis from the polling firm TargetSmart looked at the change in millennial voter registration before and after the shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. They found that since then, youth voter registration has increased nationwide by 2.1%.
We saw the response to the tragedy in Parkland was this sort of unprecedented surge in activism where you saw these Parkland students who really began the movement and brought in students from around the country where they had the March for Our Lives. And a lot of that movement was talking about turning that into political power.
Some of the biggest jumps in youth voter registration happened in key battleground states, like Pennsylvania with a 16-point increase, Virginia with a 10-point jump, and Florida with 8%.
A feeling of humility and a feeling of honor and a feeling of being blessed.
Are all emotions Michelle Joan Galvin feels when she thinks about her family's history. Jones Galvin is a fifth-generation descendant of Harriet Tubman, and along with her mother, they co-authored the book Beyond the Underground, which chronicles Tubman's life and her most precious beliefs.
Freedom for every single human being in this country and the world. She believed that no other person should own another person, and I think we can all agree to that, and that's what her work was all about.
Women are coming together to really celebrate our empowerment, the right to vote, and map out a plan for the future.
This conference, more than any other conference I've been involved in, brings together an incredibly diverse group of people that are eager to talk to each other and eager to listen to each other.
Begins, and I was in the first graduating class. All right.
Yeah.
So this is a photo of my great-great-grandmother. This is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Young women feel empowered today because if they look backwards, they'll find out that they're standing on the shoulders of the women's movement and that men and women have worked very hard to create opportunities for them.
History isn't what happened, it's who tells the story. We're moving away from the great white men, great wars, great dates, history, and that requires then we begin to know what we're celebrating, what we're commemorating.
It was really about thinking about your own calling, your own conscience. Women's freedom of conscience was connected to women's liberty, and women's liberty was also connected to the anti-slavery movement.
He said, when I ran away from slavery, I did it for myself. When I fought for abolition, I did it for my people. But when I was at Seneca Falls and fought for women's rights, there was some nobility in that act. Frederick Douglass was definitely for universal suffrage, and so he understood the importance of the vote to elevate his people, but also to protect his people from being brutalized, dehumanized, and lynched.
Thanks for your patience. I'm Tom Nastic, Public Program Producer for the National Archives, and I'd like to welcome special welcome to those watching on C-SPAN, as well as on the National Archives YouTube channel. We're very pleased to present tonight's discussion on the historic connections between the temperance and women's suffrage movements of the late 18th and early 20th centuries, or 19th and early 20th centuries. Tonight's distinguished panel is moderated by Paige Harrington, Executive Director of the Sewell Belmont House and Museum, and includes Dr. Rosalind Terborg Penn, University President Emerita, Morgan State University, Lori Osborne, Archivist and President of the Francis Willard Historical Association, and Christina Myers, Program Director at the Alice Paul Institute. The program is presented in celebration of Women's History Month and in conjunction with the National Archives exhibit, Spirited Republic, Alcohol in American History, now on display upstairs in the Lawrence F. O'Brien Gallery. Before we get to tonight's program, I'd like to tell you about a couple of other programs we'll be presenting in this theater. On Tuesday, April 7th at noon, historian Terry Alford will be here to discuss his book, Fortune's Fool, The Life of John Wilkes Booth. Public television talk show host Tavis Smiley will be joined by National Public Radio's Michelle Martin in a discussion of Smiley's recent book, My Journey with Maya, which recounts the story of programmers presented in partnership with the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. Book signings will follow both of these programs, and both will be streamed on the National Archives YouTube channel. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events in print or online. Another way to get more involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports the work of the agency, especially its education and outreach programs. Pick up your application for membership in the lobby. As I mentioned, tonight's program is tied to our new exhibit, Spirited Republic, which uses nearly 100 National Archives documents and artifacts to reveal the federal government's efforts, successes, and failures to change our drinking habits. Just a few examples related to tonight's topic include the 1888 petition from the National Women's Christian Temperance Union calling for a prohibition amendment to the United States Constitution, a design patent from 1891 for a temperance badge, and an identification card from 1921 for Daisy Simpson, one of a handful of woman agents of the Treasury Department's Prohibition Bureau. The exhibit runs through January 10th, 2016, so I hope you will have a chance to come and see it. But now to bring us deeper into the topic, it's my pleasure to turn the program over to Paige Harrington, Executive Director of the Sewell Belmont House and Museum. Previously, Paige served as the Vice President of Operations of the United States Navy Memorial and as an architectural historian at the preservation firm of architect Milford Wayne Donaldson. In addition to her work at the Sewell Belmont House and Museum, Paige serves on the Board of Directors for the National Collaborative for Women's History Sites. Would you please welcome Paige Harrington and our panel.
Thank you, Tom. It's wonderful to be here again this evening. I would say Happy Women's History Month, but I guess I will say instead, happy very last few hours of Women's History Month. But we are still very delighted to be here tonight. I hope that some of you have taken the opportunity to see the exhibit upstairs. It is absolutely fantastic. And I wouldn't be the executive director of the Sewell Belmont House unless I also made a plug for the Sewell Belmont House. I hope that you can take a look at the wonderful archive and the museum that we have on the corner of 2nd and Constitution. So our program tonight will allow us to talk in greater detail about the intersections between temperance and suffrage. So they are a little bit hazy in history. And what we have found, this panel and I, as we've been preparing for this, is that there's not a whole lot of most recent scholarship on this. So the track that we decided to take was to really look at the women themselves, because it was the women whose thoughts and origins and what they were fighting for their families and their nation went into the organizations that they were then able to move forward, and that became the movement themselves. So we'll talk a little bit about this, the way that the women galvanized for social, economic, and political change. By the mid-1880s, excessive alcohol consumption and domestic violence against women was a serious problem. The temperance issue was of concern to many women who felt that the widespread alcoholism caused detrimental effects to the family and to married life, particularly because married women at the time had few legal rights or remedies. The suffrage movement can trace its beginning to Seneca Falls in 1848, and while the legal right to vote was the ultimate goal for the women, over the next 70-plus years, there were many areas of overlap between temperance and suffrage, including improved working conditions for wage-earning women, the need for a strong public education system, and of course, full political equality. Taken together, the reform movements can be seen as a fascinating study of the individuals who participated in both movements and the organizations they created. Tonight, we will focus on a small group of women leaders, including Frances Willard, Mamie Dillard, Frances Harper, and Alice Paul. Together, the women's leadership really enabled a whole nation of women to gather, unite, and work to bring change to our nation. As Tom said, tonight we will hear from Dr. Rosalind Terborg Penn. We also have Lori Osborne from Evanston History Center and Christina Myers from Alice Paul Institute. So we will move right into the moderated part of this discussion. And I think we're going to be a few minutes behind. So I will start with Chris. Mm-hmm. And if you could talk a little bit about the early influences in Alice Paul's life. So talk a little bit about how did that influence her? What about her upbringing and her family could have influenced her later on as she became a reformer in her own right?
Sure. I think, Alice Paul, she was a Quaker, as many of our suffragists are, but she was a Hicksite Quaker. So she is following, her family followed the principles of Elias Hicks, who advocated, getting away from the materialism of life and getting back to nature and getting back to the morals of humanity. So it did tend to be the Hicksite Quakers who were the activists. They were the abolitionists. They tended to get into suffrage, not quite the suffrage that Alice Paul will get into, but they do tend to be the activists, or the reformers at least. I think, her mother was a suffragist, and we know that Alice Paul was brought to her first suffrage meetings in her hometown in Mount Laurel, or Moorestown, New Jersey. We know that had some influence, but it's really not until in her 20s when she starts to become involved in suffrage. I think what Quakerism did for her, she grew up in a very small Quaker community. It was completely Quaker in southern New Jersey. She grew up with the idea that men and women are equal, that they had roles to play, active roles to play in life. and in the community. She grew up with a sense of a social duty that you have to make the world a better place, and that is something that she did take very seriously. And she also grew up with the principle of nonviolence, and that's something that she will have to answer to when she becomes a militant suffragist, as she's called. I think that as a Quaker, all of these principles and more are just part of her daily life in this Quaker community. It's something that she grew up with. It was something that she practiced at school, in her colleges. She went to Swarthmore College. Later on, she went to Penn, but particularly at Swarthmore, a Quaker institution, these principles were just ingrained in their daily lives. So this concept of equality and the sameness of everyone around is interesting, because I think it is when she works in the settlement movement, and later she's working as a social worker, that she steps outside of that Quaker bubble. And I think that really does have an impact on her in New York and later on in London. And I think that's really what's going to help her to become a suffragist, when she realizes that life is not so equal on the outside of the Quaker community, and she starts to see what women are experiencing in some of these communities that she sees in New York and in London. So I think as a Quaker, this principle of equality, it sounds so big, but it's something that even at the age of 92, she's still talking about that concept of equality and how ordinary it is, and how much she believed in it. And I think that's ultimately what brought her into the women's suffrage movement and made her a lifelong activist for women and equality.
And we'll talk a little bit more as we move forward about the single-mindedness of Alice, and certainly a lot of the other women as well. Can you give us a little bit of a background on Alice Paul Institute and tell us a little bit about what you do now?
Officially founded in 1985, and the Institute is housed at Alice Paul's home in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. Her old, she called it the home farm. But the house has been preserved not as a historic house museum, but as a women's history center and a girls leadership development center. We thought that Alice Paul, she wouldn't have wanted a museum per se in her name. She would want us to be doing something active for the cause of equality. So we thought, you know, we need to preserve her name. We need people to remember who she is. We tell her story, and we do have our museum in her honor, but we also have our Girls Leadership Development Center, and that is the heart of what we do. We work with girls middle school through high school and beyond, and we have a series of programs from a 10-week school-based program to summertime career-focused program, and from middle school through high school, and a girls advisory council that meets once a month at Paulsdale. And I think if Alice Paul were alive, she would like to see that kind of activity happening at her home.
It is, and it's a fantastic place for those of you who have not been. It's absolutely beautiful. Let's go ahead and switch, and we'll talk to Dr. Terborg Penn for a minute. If you could tell us a little bit about some of the women that you would like to be talking about tonight, and a little bit about their origins and how they got started, and why you think that had such a impact on the work that they had done as they move forward.
Well, my work is on African American women suffragists and the various other movements that connected with the suffrage movement, and temperance definitely was one of them. And I look primarily in the 19th century and end with the women's suffrage amendment ratification. So I'm looking at from about 1830 to about 1920. But for today's activity, I decided to focus on the 19th century black suffragists who were also temperance advocates. One of the most important ones, I think, was Mary Ann Shadd Carey, who lived in Washington, D.C., and along with Frances Harper, who was from Baltimore. So, you know, they're regional people, if you know what I mean. D.C., Baltimore. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was born in Baltimore in a free black family, because if you know this, you have to understand there were two types of black populations in the 19th century, the free blacks and the enslaved blacks. And the enslaved blacks might have nominally gained their freedom in the Civil War era. But they were mostly uneducated, you know. They were rural people. So unless they were given a hand up, and often it was the free black community that came in and did that. And churches, ministers did it also. So many of the women learned about temperance in church. But organizing was something else again. And it was the formerly free black women who had the education and the knowledge to organize who did that. And Mary Ann Chedd Carey would be a very good example of that. She was originally from Delaware, moved to Washington to go to law school at Howard University. So she became a lawyer. Women's Progressive Union. And they did a variety of things, including promote for women's suffrage, but temperance was an important part of that as well. Another woman who I thought was interesting was Mamie Dillard, who came from, I can't remember if she was from Kansas or Indiana. I always have to check. I look at the movements rather than where the people are necessarily from. But I'll tell you in a minute. She was from Kansas, from Lawrence, Kansas. Okay. And she was involved in temperance work in the 1890s. And she organized several activities. But the main thing she did was to promote the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which had segregated unions. Yeah, my girl did it. She had segregated unions. So throughout the US, whether you were in the North or in the South, you belonged to a racially segregated union. But Mamie had to give them credit, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, because they did provide the movement that allowed African American women to organize among themselves. So she was an important person in this. Another woman was Mary Ann McCurdy, and she was from Indiana. So you see, these are not all Southern women. In fact, the only one who's almost Southern, but not really quite, is Frances Harper from Baltimore. And Baltimore doesn't consider themselves South.
Not very South.
No. But Maryland was a slaveholding state. McCurdy was very interested in not only women's suffrage, but temperance. And one of the things that she said was that once we get the vote, then we can work on legislation to provide in temperance, period, because intemperance is killing us all. That was a very important thing, I think you had to say, because for many poor people, whether you were black or white or whatever, you drowned your pain in liquor, alcohol. Your pain might be emotional, it might be physical. You might work so hard that you came home and all you wanted to do was go to the bar or take a bottle, and it's the same thing now with a lot of people. So they were very important, I think, as grassroots leaders. Harper House became work for the WCTU. So even on a national level, it was segregated. You had to have a black woman to supervise the black organizations nationwide. And I think you have to understand that no matter where we are in the US, this whole question of race comes up, whether it's 19th century or today. And, but they found ways to overcome it and to do the kinds of things that they needed to do to help people in their own communities. And this was important because the women in the churches, and most of the organizers would go to the black churches and start the movement rolling there. And I think that was a very good strategy. Yeah. And they tied it together. So it was not only a moral imperative, it was a political movement as well. Because you're not going to end abusive alcohol unless you have a political way of doing it. Right. So they combined the political as well as the moral in that movement.
That makes sense. So Lori, this is a good place to have you pick up so we can talk. If you give us a little bit of information, I'd like to hear a little bit about Evanston, the History Center, but then also about the Frances Willard House, and a little bit about the intersection of morality and temperance and politics.
Well, first of all, I'm very happy to be here, but I should clarify, I am not the current president of the Frances Willard Historical Association. I'm actually a past president, so not a big change, but I am the current director of the Evanston Women's History Project, which is what connects me to the WCTU archives, which exist in Evanston. The Willard House is a wonderful, amazing house museum. It's been a house museum since 1900. Probably, we're not sure, but you can't find an earlier house museum that tells the story of a woman's life in the United States or in the world. So very early historic house museum. And then the WCTU's records, they're records of their local organizations, their national organizations, and it was a worldwide organization, still is today. It's fun to come and tell their story. So I'm thinking Frances Willard kind of falls in between these two groups of women. She's at least one or two generations earlier than Alice Paul. She's born in 1839. She's the generation after the first wave of the suffrage, the suffragists in the US, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, are the generation before her, really her mother's generation. Very progressive household. Her mother was a very progressive person and really kind of really encouraged Frances to take on whatever she wanted to do. But her father was traditional. And in some ways, her early life and the sense of limitations about what she could do, and those limitations simply because she was a girl, really, and those early moments where she's noticing that her brother gets to do things like go to school, and she is not allowed to go to public school until she's almost, ready to go to college. She's educated at home. She wonders why. There's a great moment. She traces the story of her evolution on suffrage to very early in her life. She does it later in her life, but she goes way back and recalls a time when her brother goes to vote with her father, and she says to her sister, Mary, her younger sister, Mary, don't we love our do? She recounts later, so, but her sister says, yes, we do, but we can't say anything because we will be thought to be strong-minded. So there's this sense, she has this internal sense of the injustice, the inequality that she faces just because she's a girl. There's no other reason. And it comes very early in her life and then stays with her. She doesn't become vocal about it till years later. And it's her exposure to the outside world. She travels in Europe. She becomes a teacher. She has a career. She starts to get sort of informed about what she calls the woman question, which is sort of the way they phrased it in the mid-19th century. She starts to go, I think this is where my calling is in figuring out the woman question. What do we do about women's equality? But then the temperance movement, the woman's temperance movement explodes in the 1870s in the US with the Crusades that are documented in the exhibit, where women are taking to the streets and protesting in front, praying and singing and begging saloon owners to close down because of the problems of alcohol in their little towns in Ohio. And Willard, she's watched the temperance movement from afar. Her parents are Methodists, so together, but she's not involved with it. She's sort of more in the woman question thing. And when the women's movement and the temperance movement come together, she says, okay, I now see the possibilities. And what she sees is the possibilities for vast numbers of women to get out of their houses and do something, because they might not do it for the individual right that they deserve to vote or those kinds of things, but they will do it. They will become activists, protecting their homes and their families from a scourge like alcohol. So she sees an opportunity that there's, connecting the two ideas is going to create change in a big way. So that's sort of Willard's background and kind of how she kind of got to the question, connecting the two ideas. And I'm thinking that we were talking about
early influences.
Yeah. Yes. But the question that you asked me was about politics and
the intersection between.
Yeah.
Yes. So how did they? How was the? What made them move toward the political side of the issue, so that they knew that was how they were actually going to bring about change?
So the WCTU, when it gets started, after the Crusades kind of come to a close, and it looks like they're going to...
What was the number you told me earlier? It was an astonishing number of women that were...
Members of the WCTU,
yes.
250,000,
Yes.
250,000 in 1890. By far the largest organization of women in the 19th century. Yeah, and then it becomes a worldwide organization. By 1890, it's a World's Women's Christian Temperance Union. Right. They, you can't work for the vote in every country because even men don't have the vote in every country in the world in 1890. So they work on lots of other issues. Frances Willard has what she calls her do everything policy, and she really means it, that the temperance is in everything, and everything is in temperance. So they are a vast and comprehensive reform organization in her lifetime. She dies in 1898, before the real push towards suffrage in the 20th century. So she falls in that earlier generation. But going back to the start of the WCTU really is they call it the gospel temperance. It's about persuading people to change individually their alcohol use, and to persuade those saloon owners to close their doors, and to sort of individually get people signing the temperance pledge and things like that. Those early years, Willard is an officer in the WCTU. She becomes president of the WCTU in 1879, so she's the second president. And she takes it from that gospel sort of moral persuasion and the moral issue of, and it still exists, but she shifts it, and it becomes much more about politics and about gaining the vote and about changing things on a much grander scale. Exactly. So they never give up the temperance pledge, and they keep everything while they're evolving and changing. So
interesting. Now, Chris, we were talking about Alice, and I had mentioned earlier her single-mindedness. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how Alice intersected with temperance. And I think that if you take it one step further than that and talk a little bit about the other reformers that she was a part of and that she was learning from, because she was very single-minded. She was suffrage all the way.
Absolutely, and it's unusual for somebody like Alice Paul, who, we talked to our girls about who's your shero. For Alice Paul, that was Susan B. Anthony, who was involved in a lot of different movements. She was a labor rights activist, a temperance activist, and suffragist as well. Yeah. Absolutely. So, Susan B. Anthony was her own hero, and she picks up Anthony's federal work. Yet, when Alice Paul focuses and forms her own party, she becomes very single-minded. She focuses on that 19th Amendment and is criticized for not focusing on other issues that would affect women, particularly since she is successful at bringing in a lot of different types of women. She brings in different classes and different races. So, you know, women are approaching her all the time and saying, you know, why are we not focusing on temperance? Why are we not focusing on African American women's rights? You know, what about the mother that needs to feed her baby? And Alice Paul would say, you know, the vote first. You know, that was her message, that the vote is first and everything else will follow. I'm sure, although I don't have any numbers, I'm sure that a lot of her suffragists that come into the National Women's Party are also involved in the temperance movement, because I know there's a huge overlap between all of those reform movements. She has women that are interested in temperance. She has women that are, she recruits a lot of factory women, and they're in their labor rights activism. She's working with lower classes of women, and she's aware of what their needs are because she was a settlement worker, she was a social worker. So she's aware of all of these issues. I think she takes lessons from each of these campaigns. However, her focus is singly on getting women the right to vote. I think all of the movements definitely overlap, but for Alice, her single focus is going to be 19th Amendment, well, what becomes the 19th Amendment, the vote first, everything else will figure its way out or receive attention.
At that point, exactly. So it's interesting that Frances Willard had a do everything policy, and that Alice Paul had a we're going to take this one step at a time and we'll get suffrage first and then we'll move forward. But Alice was highly educated. Why don't you speak for just a minute about the degrees that she had?
She has, on display at Paulsdale, we have 6 of her degrees, and that's not even. She had 2 bachelor's, 2 master's, and 2 doctorates. She studied biology. She studied liberal arts or social work, the early form of that program. She got a doctorate in economics, and then she had her law degrees. We know that she took courses at the London School of Economics and the New York School of Philanthropy. And it's through all of these schools, through these programs, she's going to meet a lot of people who will eventually become suffragists that she's going to recruit into her movement. And also through her work in the settlement movement, she's going to meet women that will influence her, but also that she's going you know, when she coordinates this huge parade in 1913 here in DC, she encourages college women to wear their cap and gown because she's part of that generation of women who were able to go to college and receive this education. Was able to do that. So she is part of that young women's movement of the time, highly educated, and was able to move that into a career, but then into to direct a movement.
And Lori, you had mentioned, what was the year that Frances Willard passed away?
1898.
1898. So this is before.
And there were debates in the WCTU about, you know, do we do one thing? Do we do prohibition? Or do we do everything like Willard wanted them to? During her lifetime, she was such a force. Nobody would got anywhere with that conversation.
And she had a
but
huge
after
following
she's gone,
as a speaker.
Yeah, no, she was, you know, one of the most well-known women of her time. It's very strange to read accounts of her life and look at things about her and realize how little people know her story today, because she was, you know, her portrait hung on people's walls next to George Washington, you know, that kind of thing. So, after she's gone, the WCTU really has to figure out, and they don't give up on the do everything, but so they're still working on suffrage, they're still working on lots of other reforms, but they turn their eyes towards prohibition. And as the prohibition movement gains steam, then you really start to see. So the debate for reformers, I think this is probably a common debate. I don't know about a lot of other reform movements, but do we do one thing and focus and do it well and get it done? Or do we try to be a broad movement where we're really trying to affect change across the board?
Yeah.
And, you know, they debated it and had various answers.
Definitely, and it's generational too. I mean, you
Right.
can see it. You can track the various movements, and you can see who picks up from who, and then who moves on.
Yeah.
This concept of education and whether or not they had an early access to education or early influence on education. Dr. Terborg-Penn, you said something earlier that was very fascinating. You were talking about the difference between the two communities, and there was an enslaved community, and then there were freed blacks. And it was the freed people who had access to education and could bring that to the others.
But interestingly enough, gain her freedom when she's an adult and moves into the reform business period. Right. Abolition, women's suffrage, and she advocated for temperance. And her argument was too many mothers complain that their husbands spend all of the family money on alcohol. And she's talking about black mothers. And she says, oh, I know they're miserable. You know, I know they're unhappy. That's why they're drinking. So to drown their pain, they're using the family money. And the mothers were just up in arms. So Truth, when she was in Topeka, Kansas, believe it or not, was talking about how you've got to combine suffrage and temperance, because this is the only way we're going to get legislation that's going to help the poor women who are suffering now. So it was a class thing as well.
Right. Absolutely, economic factors in there.
Yeah,
of course.
The problem with alcohol, the level of the problem in those years is hard for us to really wrap our brains around. We think so differently about alcohol than they did. We consume so much less. If you see the exhibit, there's jugs, and that compare how much raw alcohol people drank in different time periods, and you know, it's astonishing. So it's hard for us to kind of, and the prohibition, you know, it's a little bit of a joke, you know, it's kind of comical. Oh yeah, we're going to ban alcohol. Does anyone really think that would work, you know? But for them, it was serious. Especially, it was all those women and all the suffering in all those families and all the children. You know, I mean, you know, if you're impoverished because someone has drank away his wages and your wages, because you do not have rights to your own wages, what, you know, I mean, this is a serious problem. So,
and it crossed race and class, which I found very interesting.
It's fascinating.
Yeah,
it is. Tell me a little bit more about the role of the church. So it wasn't just as a religious organization, but it was also as a mechanism,
social movements. Yes, yeah. The preachers, and it depended on, of course, the kind of preachers that you had, as well as the kind of leadership among the women in the church. And for most black churches, and I don't go to white churches, so I don't know. But in the black churches that I know of, there are more women. Is this true internationally or nationally? More women in churches?
Yes.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
So the women would say to the minister, we've got to do something about this. And if he wanted to keep his congregation from moving on to another, he would have to listen to them. And so they invited people. He would invite people, or the deacons would invite people who could give a social movement message, not preaching, but you know, after church, go down and have whatever, repast, and then this person would come and speak. And so Sojourner Truth did that, a lot of that. But so did these other educated women as well.
And how do you think that what type of education are we talking about? It's essentially just bringing awareness and also making sure that the women are seeing that there is a path out?
Well, I think what they were saying is, especially we're not talking about the Deep South, we're talking about the North and the Middle West in particular. These are the places where I found this. If your men could vote, and in some of these Midwestern places, you could vote before the 19th Amendment. if your men could vote, then they need to pressure the politicians to put this together. I suspect, even though I haven't found any evidence of this, that in some of these denominations, maybe the Methodists in particular, the black preachers and the white preachers would get together and talk about, why don't we bombard our people this week and talk about the reasons that we need to lessen up this drinking. Somebody needs to do a study of that, but I haven't. But I find it very interesting that these connections were being made by these women. Now, Sojourner Truth was an illiterate woman. So she must have, she went to lectures, she heard, she went to something like this and would gather the information. So we're not talking about people reading about this necessarily. They would often go to, they'd go to revivals, and that I thought was fascinating.
Yeah, the church was powerful in making this spread.
And
the
at the
WCTU
revival, they
took
talk
advantage
about
of
it.
it.
Yeah, they would talk about this at a revival.
And I think the suffrage movement, I know with Alice Paul and her party, they're going to play upon that moral duty that women have, that they would, their piousness. They're going to play upon that in bringing more women into the suffrage ranks. I don't think that they were dishonest. They really did believe that, and I think Alice Paul did believe that women were the moral half of the world. But that's going to be a strong factor in bringing in women into that latter part of the women's suffrage movement.
Yeah, the Frances Willard coined a term, and she didn't coin it, but she used it strategically. She called, when she starts advocating for the vote and getting the WCTU to advocate for the vote, she at first seeks the ballot for home protection issues only. And she calls it the home protection ballot. And that would be just on the saloons in your town, just on school boards. Like, we don't need the vote on every home. And women she sort of starts to frame this idea that women bring that moral influence into, and they should be, it's not outside their sphere of activity. It's just an extension of the home, and for them to have this kind of ballot. And then it changes over time. That's earlier in the evolution. But
they start to take that phrase and turn it into municipal housekeeping, that women will use their vote for moral purposes. They will help and give a
And all three of you have mentioned to me at different times and in different ways, but you've talked about rights versus duty. Is it a woman's right to do these things, or is it her duty to do these things? That was something that I think you all had talked about at one time or another. And Lori, you also said something that was interesting to me. You were drawing a parallel between the suffrage movement and the temperance movement, and you were talking about the temperance movement was front-loaded, so at a very early time when you're looking at suffrage, there were an inordinate amount of women that were involved in this. And then when that started to wane a bit, then suffrage really started to move forward.
Well, and the temperance movement, because it's so grassroots and connected with all the churches, it really has its fingers in every little town in America at some point. Every county in every state has a WCTU. Like, there's almost, it's a huge, not, it's not every single, but it's a huge organization. It has its fingers kind of everywhere. So that it provides the grassroots for the suffrage movement at a key time. It doesn't maintain that. The suffrage movement, there's ebbs and flows here, but at an important time, I'd say the 1880s, was the time when it really was. But this is, we've in all our conversations, we've been coming up with great research projects.
Yes, we have.
And this is the one that someone really could explore, is what really was that relationship of the two. We also know that a lot of suffrage workers who were early suffrage workers move over to the temperance movement at a certain point, because they start to think, oh, maybe this home protection idea, maybe this is going to work. Maybe this is actually going to get us the vote. So maybe we should shift our focus a little bit here and start working in temperance, and that's going to get the ballot quicker. And then, you know, those brewers and distillers and that vast amount of money that's in alcohol kind of comes rearing its head, and it becomes the main anti-suffrage source of the anti-suffrage movement is those brewers and distillers and their national organizations.
Now, with the black women, the 1870s is when they connect the temperance and suffrage. And this is, of course, emancipation. I mean, this is post-Civil War, and Reconstruction era. So there's a lot more political fluidity going. And and I think the preachers understood that too. And if you brought in some key women who could stir up the other women, it would be significant, because they didn't want you wasting all your money in the bars. They wanted you to come and put your coins in the church. So there are a lot of political as well as moral reasons that connect this. I see a lot of this as a combination of things. But the political tends to be pro-family. Let's eliminate the disintegration of families through alcohol abuse. I mean, they used the word abuse, which I thought was which is modern for today.
Very,
you know.
Very. So that's a good segue for us to talk a little bit about the path of suffrage or the path of temperance, and women from different communities at different times picked one up and set the other one down, depending on what they were trying to push through and what the avenue was. So was it a duty or was it a right? Was it home protection, or was it because we need to get the vote to secure everything else? Let's start with Chris, who's on the far end. Alice Paul is on the far end of that spectrum, which is the vote comes first.
Yes.
So expand on what you were talking about before.
I think
a little bit about that.
You know, you talked about duty versus right. I think Alice Paul was interesting in that she gave a lot of, I don't want to say lip service, but publicly she gave a lot of respect towards this municipal housekeeping or home protection, or towards reformers, and this idea of the women as the helpmate. You know, the moral persuaders, moral influence in society. She gave that a lot of public respect. She talked about it. You know, she said, you know, women are the peaceful half of the world. But I see it in her documents and behind closed doors. She is following the, you know, this is our right line of thinking. She, as a lawyer, she has a certain understanding of the Constitution, but I think before she had studied law, she has an idea, and I don't know if it's from being a Quaker or through her political studies and her economic studies, she believes that men and women are equal. So she gives some attention to the woman as a helpmate, but behind closed doors, she is advocating for the woman. This is her right, and not necessarily that sense of duty. So it's kind of interesting because she can't push that angle too much because she would lose some of her supporters. But this is definitely more radical, and it's something, you know, that even Elizabeth Cady Stanton struggled with, you know, when she talked about in one of her last speeches about, you know, should we be fighting for the right to vote because we are mothers or because we are women, or we are human beings. So I think Alice Paul would have definitely argued that, and she had a very strict understanding of the Constitution and law that she said, you know, truly women are human beings and they need to fight for their human rights as citizens, not to necessarily be helpmates, but to be full equal citizens with the equal standing of the law. So, you know, she kind of always walked that fine line. She didn't want to make anybody angry on either side, but I think that in her heart she leaned more towards the vote as a right for women.
Definitely.
So it's so interesting because I don't think we give them a lot of, well, we do, but other people may not give them credit for being such strategic thinkers about who they're trying to persuade. Who are they trying to get to do what? And so while Alice is, you know, having to confront the idea that she's got to, you know, embrace domestic housekeeping, you know, or municipal housekeeping, Frances is having to be strategic and really develop the whole idea of municipal housekeeping and home protection. She very much, even at an early age, was all about rights. It was about rights for her, but she didn't believe that if she talked a lot about rights, she would gain the kind of acceptance that she needed. In her time period, if you started talking with women about, you deserve this right, you would lose them. So the whole idea of you are a mother, you are a sister, you are a wife, you are, you know, a daughter, you have moral duty. These are part of your job. This is part of your job in the world, is to protect your family from all of this, to help them gain that protection. And this is just an extension of your duties in that area of your life for her. And she really, you know, a lot of scholarship around this issue will tend to say it's either rights or it's duties. It's one or the other. I think most suffragists embraced both of them, but just to varying degrees. And they had to do it at different times for different reasons. And it wasn't, each argument wasn't exclusive. It's not like they said, oh, well, we're all about this one or not all about that one. So I think for Willard, it swung towards the other way.
Yeah, but that was interesting because until we had the conversation a week or so ago, I hadn't really thought about picking up one of the arguments and then setting it down when it was less than palatable for a certain group, and then picking up the other one. And you were talking about this as well, because you were saying that for some of the women, it was just a means to an end, because they were really focused on improving the economics of their family. It came down to economics. It was very simple, and they would pick up whichever one they needed. Can you tell me a little bit? Well, pick up that conversation.
Yeah. The problem, of course, as most of you know, is for the majority of African Americans, they are either first or second generation free, okay, by the end of the 19th century. Very few were born out. Marianne Chedd Carey's family was free born, living in a slave state, but Delaware is a border state. They're not in Alabama. So you find that the majority of black women who are in these positions are in the minority in terms of education. They are educated. They are a minority. But their influence is significant because they were willing to interchange with the poorer women, and I think they understood that if they didn't do that, the race, as they would say, is doomed. So there are practical, as I said, as well as political and moral reasons for all of this. I didn't find anybody who was a temperance advocate. All of the temperance advocates that I found, after I finished my dissertation, which was on African Americans in general who supported women's suffrage, I decided to focus on the women in particular and built from there. I didn't find anybody who didn't political power. So morality is one thing, but the ability to implement the policies that you want are something else again. So you have to be able to have the ammunition to do that, and the vote of the ballot box was the ammunition. So for African Americans, I think they're very pragmatic about this whole thing.
With the fact that economy, economic factors is
part of it is
underlying for all of these different groups. I mean, that is, it's very clear. We have a few more minutes before we'll open it up to questions from the audience, but I wanted to talk a little bit, have you each talk a little bit about the two more things for the movement. First off, we know that there wasn't a lot of, there was a lot of overlap with picking up one piece and putting it down and then picking up temperance, for instance, and then moving that forward. So we know that a lot of the groups went back and forth. It's just that they went back and forth very, very often. But we tend to hear a little bit more about that there was less than collegial working between all of the women. A little bit about the individuals. You had said at one point that that there were several women, and including Frances Willard, who specifically put down one task like temperance and moved right into suffrage, depending on who she was talking to. So it's definitely based on the different audience groups, but it was also according to the time. So since we're talking about different time frames here and different generations, maybe we can talk a little bit about that intersection. So say, for instance, I mean, Frances Willard had passed before Alice was even, was she even in England by then?
I think so.
Was she?
Yeah, not quite, yeah.
But but this was very, very early on.
The settlement movement is just growing.
Yeah,
definitely. No, it's definitely the generation before.
So what happened after Frances Willard had died? Where did that part of the movement
I'm not the expert on the WCTU after her death is a whole other story, and a very interesting story. But they do as an organization, it's hard. She was such a figure in their world. They have a wonderful headquarters building in downtown Chicago, built for them by Daniel Burnham. Huge skyscraper in the middle of the loop. And they decide that they're going to move their headquarters to the little house, our little Victorian cottage in Evanston. So her death really, really shook them. It came suddenly. She was young. She was a very, very active reformer, and boom, she gets the flu. And she wasn't well in those later years in her life, but she died of influenza. So, they're really shook, and they really struggle with their focus. And I think that also causes them to, when you lose a key leader,
right?
It's hard. But then they shift their focus and they come back strong, and that's when Prohibition really is their thing.
Right.
But they didn't give up on everything else. It was always a do everything movement a little bit.
Yeah. And it's still obviously it's still an active organization, and that's not where you're not in that organization, but they are active. And you had said something about the influence that they have globally.
Yeah,
not just in America. So
they are still a worldwide organization. One of their largest. I just was in India and visited with the WCTU of India, and their headquarters in Delhi. So they've changed. It's not the same organization it was 100, but it's still existing. It's still
fascinating.
Yeah, it's amazing.
In India.
In India.
Yeah, I know.
And largely Christian, you said.
I know, and largely Christian.
Which is fascinating.
So,
Chris, obviously Alice was, and her group, the National Women's Party, was successful at getting suffrage passed and then, of course, ratified. That was not the end of her quest, though. That was, again, sort of a means to an end. So talk a little bit about the next few decades for Alice and what she was doing.
Even as she's taking her celebratory photos when women get the right to vote, she says that's a foot in the door, but she already knows that there needs to be more legislation, particularly in the Constitution. So she did write the Equal Rights Amendment. It was introduced in 1923 and introduced into every session of Congress from 1923 until 1972. And she's going to dedicate the rest of her life working for the ERA in the United States. She is going to do work abroad, though. She will start the World Women's Party, headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland, and she's working for women's suffrage internationally, but also all kinds of legislation that's going to affect women, everything from custody to citizenship to wages and things that would affect women legally. But really, the ERA is the heart of what she is doing after 1920, in her very later years, she is going to encounter the women's liberation movement, and it's kind of interesting because all of these issues, all of this overlap of issues is going to come back to her, and people are going to be critical of her. Why are you not paying attention to the civil rights movement? Why are you not paying attention to mothers who need daycare services? And she said the same thing again. She said, well, when we get the ERA, we will be able to address all of these issues legally in the court system. So she dedicates her life towards the ERA, and even in her final years, in her 90s, she is starting to speak to reporters, because 72, Congress did pass the Equal Rights Amendment, but it goes to the states for ratification. So it's in this time period where she kind of knows that it was given that 7-year deadline. It was extended to 10 years. And I think she knew in her heart that it was going to have a hard time getting the full ratification. And indeed, that is what happens. By 1982, the ERA falls 3 states short of ratification. So I always joke, if Alice Paul were alive today, she'd stop the presentation as it is and put you all to work on the Equal Rights Amendment.
Yes,
she'd have you on the phone. She'd have you all over social media. She truly believed in this document. And again, that single focus was on, let's get it into the Constitution. We'll give women a legal leg to stand on, and then we'll work on all of these other issues that have come up during the suffrage movement, but that came up again during women's liberation and continue today.
What year did she die?
1977. She was 92 years old and still on the phone trying to get the ERA passed.
And she worked in the House, the Sewell Belmont House. She
Mm-hmm.
worked in the House until 1974, 75.
Yes, until she couldn't walk up the steps. Yes.
Exactly. So it's interesting generationally, because we had said earlier that Alice and that generation of suffragists were the young upstarts. So, they were the new generation that came in and started, again, militant type strategies and really moving that forward. And they were seen as the newest of what's going forward with suffrage and leaving some of the older generations behind. And then you get to a place in Alice's life just tracking over her life. And she then becomes, and the women of the National Women's Party, become the older generation. And so there are plenty of younger women who are organizing at that. The older generation.
Yes. They were literally called the old women on the hill by, I think, Gloria Steinem. Yes.
Oh,
See what goes on there.
But it is. I mean, and you can see it generationally. It is, absolutely. Dr. Terborg-Penn, can you tell us a little bit about, because in our earlier conversations, we didn't really have a chance to get into this, but I'm interested to know, what about the next generation of African-American women? Where did they go from after they formulated in the church and they were working on economic issues and voting issues?
The 20th century suffragists? Well, they hated Alice Paul. They called her a racist.
Definitely.
And Mary Church Terrell, I don't know how many of you know that name. Is there a high school or a junior high school Terrell?
Yeah.
After her husband, Judge, but Mary Church Terrell lived in D.C. for many, many years and was the first president of the National Association of Colored Women. She said, we've got to be pragmatic about this, And she said, but then Alice Paul just got to her to the point where she told the leaders of the NAACP, Walter White in particular, I just can't deal with her anymore, he said. Let's be practical. She's got the power, so we've got to deal with her. But black suffragists considered her to be quite a racist. And Mary Church Terrell tells Walter White, you know, if she could get away with this amendment being for white women only, she would do it. I found that in the Mary Church Terrell papers, which are at the Library of Congress. And Walter, and the NAACP papers are there too, and I was able to corroborate, you know, I said, oh, this is hot. And I looked at it, and Walter White said, yeah, I know, we all know that, but, you know, let's not make any big fuss. You can't walk around her or get rid of her, so you're gonna have to work with her. Classic racist.
Well, the issue of equality and the upbringing of Alice. Can you add anything to that? Because we do know definitely what, you know, when she was organizing and when there was a choice to be made between more populous southern states that wouldn't have participated if African American women had been given the same rights to participate in parades or whatever they were.
Let them go to the end.
She said, we will err on the side of the numbers and we will bring in the bigger groups.
Right.
So it's a difficult situation to look at it back through today's eyes and think, well, we certainly wouldn't make that same call today.
Yes,
we wouldn't make that choice.
We would. Yes, we would. I hate
maybe we
to
would.
deal with it, different with you. I hate to say it, but the way things have been in recent years, just a variety of unfortunate things that have happened in the news, and that's the thing. We see everything. People snapping everything, so you see everything that's happening. It's covert now because you can't be overt about it and get away with it. But things have changed, but they haven't changed that much.
No, it's not utopia yet.
No. But you got to keep on fighting it, and that's basically what the NAACP, the National Association of Colored Women's Groups, they all decided on the same strategy. We have to do what we can covertly because we know that if we overtly cry for all this, there'll be some, like Alice Paul, who would say, no, we don't need them, you know.
Yeah.
We need the Southern white vote first.
Right. And you were, you know, earlier you were talking about the WCTU and the segregated unions. Yeah, it was definitely a challenge for them because they knew they could grow. Right. They knew there was a lot of church women and they knew they needed to grow in the South. And so how do we grow in the Black women involved and how do we do what we would want them to do, you know, and they definitely found themselves in some quandaries about the choices that they made, and not all of them were good choices or choices we would approve of today. Right. But they struggled, I think.
I think Alice Paul is interesting because she's a Quaker, but also she is charged with racism. I think that we are seeing her through a lens, honestly, because when it comes down to the hard choices, she did give credence to those Southern white women in that parade and later on. But while Carrie Chapman Catt's winning plan includes a compromise in Southern states to fight for white suffrage, Alice Paul does not settle for a compromise in Southern states. She's going to advocate for a federal women's suffrage amendment. So I do know that she does have to negotiate with, you know, lots of different groups, but, you know, I think that there's still more research to be done when it comes to Alice Paul and what's happening behind the scenes.
The WCTU had national conventions,
Yes.
and everyone was invited. All unions, everybody sent a representative. And that meant there were African American women at those meetings, those national meetings. And I'm wondering what other women's organization at the time had
But they
both
met with the superintendent of colored work.
Well, they met in the general meeting too, and they were on the stage. They were, if they were a superintendent, they were speaking and giving reports. It's something I don't know a lot about, to be honest. I'm curious about it. I really would like to know, you know, really how integrated was it? Was it integrated really at all, or only a little bit, or? You know, how really was it? And I don't know for
I don't
sure.
know about the national meetings, but my speculation is if you have a superintendent of quote unquote colored work who's sitting on the stage, I'm sure she was because she was part of that centralized leadership, you might all meet in the same place, but they had a colored section. I bet they did. I bet they had a colored section.
Yeah, I wonder if they did.
Because that's what life was like.
Yeah, I wonder if the Southern women would, you know, I don't know. This is a great research.
As long as they didn't have to sit with black women in the pews, they'd be fine because the black women would be in the last row. So that would be fine. But then I would think. But the idea that they would get a superintendent of colored work and not just completely ignore the black women, I think is significant. But you have to also understand the majority of black people in that time period lived in the southern states, the formerly enslaved states. So you don't have that much lobbying from black people in the north because the majority of people are still in the south. You don't get that migration until right after World War I, which is what, 2 or 3 years before the ratification of the amendment.
Right.
So you still have this very significant Southern black population. And although you had educated people, because you have these, what we call today, these historically black colleges throughout the South, most of which were founded in the from the 1870s, Howard, I think, was, what, 1870 something, to about the turn of the century. So you still had a significant number of them. And this is where your so-called black elite were being educated.
Were they co-educational?
Oh yeah, most of them were.
Okay.
In fact, I don't think I can I don't know if, now see, Spelman and Morehouse.
Might have been all male.
Oh, yeah. Morehouse was across the street from Spelman. So it was like the boy. You had, I know of at least those two.
Right.
There's also one in Virginia, which will come to me in a minute. But the majority of what we call HBCUs now, historically black colleges and universities, were co-ed. And most of the people were what we would call middle class. You know, the doctors and the lawyers' children, went the post office people who often had political appointments, the rich farm owners, because you did have some. And then you had people from the north who would send their children to these schools in the South because there were very few. There were some in Philadelphia. In fact, Cheney University was that early antebellum black school that eventually became Cheney University in Philadelphia. But this idea of you can't get rid of them, you know, so you have to sort of work around them, is because we do need them for some things. You know? So it's interesting.
It is.
But you had to have a professional group to maintain this segregated society.
Yeah, it is. And I think if we've come up with, I don't know that we've come up with any answers here tonight. We've probably just come up with a whole host of new research. I know that Lori and Chris have said that many times before. So we have probably about 15 more minutes that we can take questions from the audience, and they can be general questions or they can be questions directed to a certain person. But if you would like to go ahead and start queuing up, there are microphones on both sides. You could queue up on either side. He did, and he's fast, so we'll just go ahead and start with him.
So The word tempering, to my understanding, means moderation. It doesn't mean abstinence. When did the group switch from reduced alcohol consumption to cutting it off entirely? Was Women's Christian, whatever, was it abstinence from the beginning, or was it moderation and they switched?
It was abstinence. They just used the word temperance.
Yeah.
The language is really important, right? We know that, or the words people use, and that's what they meant, the 19th century, when they're talking the temperance movement. They don't use the word prohibition right away. I don't know exactly when that word kind of comes in. It may come in earlier. I just don't know. But it's woman's, by the way. If you want to spell it correctly, you use the A.
Yes, A.
Plural, woman's, Christian temperance.
Right over on this side.
I guess this is for whoever might know the answer. In both the temperance and suffrage movement, what role did men play, particularly in leadership? I mean, did they sort of take over when they got in, or did women?
In the temperance movement, men were, in the WCTU, men were not allowed to be leaders at all. Francis Willard called the WCTU the WCT University because it was a training ground for women to be leaders. It really was all about women's leadership. And women ran the meetings. She knew that if men were allowed to have a role as a leader, that the women would defer to them. So they weren't allowed. It was not allowed. So it was very consciously that way.
It wasn't that way with suffrage. It wasn't that way with suffrage. Because at Seneca Falls, they had a man, I forget who it was, who chaired the thing. And Frederick Douglass was there.
Yeah.
And
he was there and he spoke.
Was that what?
I think it was.
Yeah.
Yes, it was.
So, and throughout, and I think that was deliberate, because you're not going to get men to listen to the women, so you need male surrogates to speak for them, because it's the men who can vote.
Right.
You know, so I can see the method in that madness.
You know, with Alice Paul's party, it was women. I mean, there was a joke about Alice's cousin one time. After the Second World War, he was a soldier and he stayed at the Sewell Belmont, and she said, "You're the only man has stayed at the Sewell Belmont." I thought that was kind of interesting. They actually did have a contingent of men that marched in the 1913 parade, so they're certainly supporters. And they, we know that she worked with a team of lawyers. That, you know, there's one gentleman that really goes to bat as an attorney for the suffragists. He's a real supporter. But there's also some funny stories of Alice Paul. You know, when these lawyers would come in, she would have them do work like, you know, put some stamps on these envelopes. And they never did that before because nobody ever treated them as secretaries. So I think that she definitely, the Sewell Bell, or the headquarters definitely was all female, almost consistently, but they certainly had their male supporters, but did not let them take leadership positions.
And the temperance movement had all sorts of men's organizations that were mostly men, the Anti-Saloon League, the Prohibition Party, there were all sorts of men involved in temperance, so that they didn't need that, you know, that part of it, that activity.
Yeah, they didn't. Fascinating. Right here.
Yes, lots of questions raised, so much more to learn. And actually what you were just saying touches on one of the thoughts that popped up for me was temperance, the push for temperance. I was wondering if that had an impact on sort of turning a lot of men off the idea of women getting the vote because, hey man, or at least if they didn't drink themselves, a lot of men say, no way do you let these women get the vote because I don't want to lose my right to drink. But that's not my main question. A few years ago, I wrote a white paper on the history of social movements in the U.S. and where my sense is they've typically broken down around race and class. My understanding was that the women's movement sort of grew out of the abolitionist movement. A lot of the middle-class women got their training in the abolitionist movement. And there were also a lot of working-class women involved early on. But then when, I don't know, 1840s, 1850s, you had all of those bloodbaths going on, you know, at the factories in Lowell and the mining camps out west, with there were just, you know, so many people, thousands of people, poor people dying. And my understanding was some of the suffragettes saying, but just cross the picket line, you know, just you know, and just really not getting the poverty conditions and the life and death conditions of the working class women. So they mostly left. Well, the suffragettes saying, but hey, if you get the vote, it's all going to be good.